The next item of business is Stage 1 debate on motion 21712 in the name of Michael Russell on the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons? And for information for all of those taking part, there will be 3 ministers who will contribute at the start of this debate within the allotted time for the government. First of all, I call Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion for up to 7 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, on the 24th of March, this Parliament considered the UK Coronavirus Bill, giving it the legislative consent it required. That bill contained the first part of the emergency legislative response to the coronavirus outbreak, empowering public health regulations to be made to control transmission of the disease and making necessary changes to reserve law in Scotland. That was for the so-called lockdown regulations. At the start of April, the Parliament considered, amended and passed the Coronavirus Scotland Bill. That bill addressed the major challenges that coronavirus is causing and will cause within our legislative responsibilities. It protected tenants and those who might be suffering financial distress as a result of the outbreak. It made changes which allowed our system of justice to continue, and it provided flexibility and relief to those public services on the front line of the fight against the outbreak. Now, I was clear at that time and said to the Chamber that the Government was considering further primary legislation on the subject of coronavirus. And it is that further primary legislation, the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill, that we are considering today. It will supplement and complement those first 2 pieces of primary legislation. This bill has arisen as a result of 2 processes. Firstly, a thorough process of consideration and testing across all Scottish Government portfolios of any remaining measures required as a result of the pandemic. And it also follows a process of engagement across the parties in this Parliament and with stakeholders to see what further ideas there were for urgent or necessary measures that could only be delivered through primary legislation. That process is in keeping with the frank and transparent approach the Scottish Government have tried to take to all aspects of the legislative response. But legislation is only a small part of the effort to control the virus and adapt to the extraordinary steps we as a society have to take. We also have a range of secondary legislation as part of the response. And recent SSIs considered by this Parliament include those that have adapted the system of school placing requests, provided relief for certain non-domestic rates, and provided much of the system of electricity consent applications online. As emergency legislation, we believe that bills, that is primary legislation, should only contain provision that is urgent and necessary and unavoidable. Where a policy can be achieved out with a bill through an SSI or through a change to guidance, that is what we will do and have been doing. And as in emergency legislation, we believe that giving Parliament a proper and full role in post-legislative scrutiny is essential, so is scrutiny of all secondary legislation. We agree with the DPLR committee on that, but it is up to the Parliament to decide how that should go forward. This second bill follows exactly the scheme of the first in all regards. It will expire at the end of September unless renewed by this Parliament. It can only be renewed twice. The reporting obligations in the bill will follow exactly the same timetable as those in the first bill. This will mean that the Parliament will receive a single report on the provisions of the UK Act, the first Scottish Act in this bill, keeping Parliament and the public informed about the use of these powers and ensuring that none of them last a moment longer than is proportionate or necessary. And I will shortly make proposals to the Parliament about the structure and nature of that reporting, first of all approaching the Presiding Officer in the Bureau and the convener of the COVID committee. This bill also has the same duty in regard to equality and non-discrimination that was put into the first bill, and it is reproduced on the face of this bill. Presiding Officer, my colleagues, the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning and the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People will shortly cover 2 major policies in the bill. The outbreak is, however, causing financial difficulty to many, so let me outline some other proposals that we will make in it. The bill contains temporary changes to the system of bankruptcy to make it easier and cheaper to access. The bill contains a power allowing non-domestic rates relief, which already includes 100% relief for 2021 to help support businesses in the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors and to apply retrospectively where necessary in the year 2021. The bill makes some amendments to the justice system to complement those made by the first Act. For example, it temporarily allows adjournments in summary cases to last for longer than 28 days. It extends the time limits by which people have to pay confiscation orders under the Proceeds of Crime Act. It allows electronic registration in the registers of inhibitions and judgments. And it moves the courts from a system of advertising court actions on the walls of the court to advertising them online. All the measures in these bills are temporary. That is written onto the face of the Act too. It's not impossible that we may, as a government, as a parliament and as a society, learn a great deal about what is possible from the way we have adapted to this crisis. But that is for later. Presiding Officer, the bill also makes a number of changes to statutory deadlines, which reflects the realities that the effects of this outbreak on our society are going to continue for some time yet. But the absolute priority of the government at all levels remains the protection of human life. Now, the minor changes include amendments to the delaying of the UEFA Euro 2020 Championship till 2021, allowing more flexibility about when the Citizens' Assembly on climate change can be held, giving registered social landlords more time to file their audited accounts, and giving ministers more time to make their statement on local connection under the Housing Act. Presiding Officer, I want to mention one other thing, and I think it does reflect on the process, cross-party process, which this bill has been part of. Earlier this week, Mr Fraser, and then yesterday at committee, Mr Tompkins, raised with me the question of marriage and the fact that for many people it appeared to be impossible to have a marriage during this period. There has been an immense burden upon registrars, and we recognise that. And it would not be possible under the social distancing legislation, or indeed, given those burdens, to make a wider permission for marriage than exists. This is an important issue. Such marriages sometimes are sought for intensely personal, unavoidable and sad reasons. They can include a terminal diagnosis, a need to leave the country, for example, for military service, or a need to get married or maintain a status under immigration and asylum law. I'm satisfied that there's no change to the current law needed. Indeed, although under normal circumstances at least 28 clear days have to be allowed, it is possible for that rule to be waived by the Registrar General. But the committee, and yesterday Mr Tompkins in particular, raised an important point, which is that public understanding of this ability and the understanding of how to access it and the consistency of approach across Scotland is particularly important. And I thank Mr Tompkins, Mr Fraser and others who have raised it for making the point. So I can therefore announce today that the Scottish Government is urgently preparing guidance on the matter in conjunction with the National Records of Scotland to be published and publicised shortly. This will set out how and who to ask for an emergency marriage, where to find the information people need. And in the meantime, anyone who does need a marriage urgently should contact their religious or belief body and the National Records for Scotland at the email address marriage@nrscotland.gov.uk. Presiding Officer, these measures might seem as like a miscellany of technical and temporary fixes, but this bill can't be seen alone. It should be read alongside the first bill, the UK Act, the public health regulations, the programme of SSIs, and the range of action and advice by government, industry and society. Taken together, those are our collective response to the greatest challenge of our times. Not everything can be fixed by legislation, but there are some very important protections in this bill, and they are given to those who most need them. And to set out some of those, allow me to pass over to my colleague, Mr Stewart.
Kevin Stewart, for absolutely no more than 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. During the first coronavirus bill, I committed to bringing to Parliament a proposal to deal with the invidious situation still facing some students living in purpose-built student accommodation. While students living in the mainstream private rented sector have been able to end their tenancies early by giving their landlords 28 days notice under the Private Housing Tenancies Scotland Act 2016, this has not been the case for these students. Many providers have behaved fairly and reasonably in these extraordinary circumstances, and I'm pleased that all universities and colleges and a number of the larger providers allowed their tenants to end their contracts early. Some students have not been allowed to do so, which has led to this legislation. These are student tenancies. Their only purpose is to facilitate the accommodation of the student while at university or college. And the coronavirus outbreak and the need to observe the lockdown and stay safe has led to universities and colleges closing down and moving their students online where possible. And of course, many students have chosen to move home to be with family rather than stay in provided accommodation in a place where their course is no longer being provided. Therefore, clearly the purpose of these tenancies can no longer be fulfilled, and in this unprecedented time, students must be able to end those tenancies. That demands a response, and as a result, the bill introduces a 7-day notice to leave period for those currently tied into a student accommodation contract, and a 28-day notice to leave period for agreements entered into while these provisions are in force. The 7-day period provides an effective out for those currently tied into these contracts who are yet unable to benefit from them. The 28-day period will give students seeking accommodation for next academic year reassurance that should the uncertainty about the operation of universities continue, an appropriate notice period will exist in respect of that tenancy. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government regards such provisions as a fair and balanced solution that reflects the fact that in many cases what we're dealing with is a contract, the fundamental purpose of which can no longer be delivered. They will bring welcome relief to those both bound into such contracts currently and to those contemplating entering into one in the near future. I'll now pass on, Presiding Officer, to my colleague, the Social Security Cabinet Secretary.
I call Shirley-Anne Somerville. If you could use up less time than 4 minutes, that'd be useful, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's unpaid carers are a vital lifeline for those they care for, and it is clear that the coronavirus pandemic has put an additional pressure on them. Many will now face higher costs and extra caring responsibilities as a result of the changes we've all had to make to stop the spread of the virus and save lives. This government values hugely the support that Scotland's carers provide to their friends, family and neighbours. The first devolved benefit Scotland introduced was the Carers Allowance Supplement as an additional payment to the Carers Allowance. This twice-yearly payment has helped tens of thousands of carers over the past 2 years, with around £460 a year of support that is not available outside Scotland. But now we need to do more. Therefore, I am introducing a one-off coronavirus carers allowance supplement to give carers the extra support they need at this time. I am proposing through this bill to make an additional payment of £230.10 alongside their normal supplement payment in June. This payment will be made automatically by Social Security Scotland, meaning carers do not need to do anything to get this extra financial support. Provisions already in place for the supplement mean this financial support will not be taken from elsewhere in the benefits system. This will mean around 83,000 eligible carers in Scotland getting £690.30 this year in addition to their carers allowance, an additional investment of £19 million from this one additional carers allowance supplement alone. Those in receipt of carers allowance are some of our lowest income carers with some of the most intensive caring roles, and I hope this additional payment will reduce the financial pressures these carers are experiencing, particularly as the majority do not benefit from the UK Government's increase to universal credit. In addition, we've already made changes to the first Coronavirus Scotland Bill and through regulations to protect carers' access to carers allowance supplement and the Young Carers Grant. These changes mean carers can be eligible for support in many circumstances where the pandemic has affected their ability to apply on time or changed the nature of their caring role. We are continuing to build on a wide range of support and guidance that we have already put in place for all of Scotland's unpaid carers, young and adult. We are working alongside the carers organisations to make sure that carers can get the right support to help protect them and their loved ones. And this includes short breaks for caring, access to PPE and testing, as well as financial support. Much of this information, advice and support is provided by local carer and young carer services, and recognising that these services are a lifeline for carers in our communities, we have made available £500,000 funds to support them to move to remote working, ensuring carers can get the most up-to-date information and support over the phone or online. In conclusion, we have heard from many carers the difference that our carers allowance supplement payments have already made to their lives, and I hope that members will support this bill, which will ensure eligible carers receive a double supplement in June.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And before we move on, can I gently remind our ministers it's for the Chair to call speakers, not for them to pass on. Thank you very much. And we'll move on now. And I call Murdo Fraser on behalf of the COVID-19 Committee for up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm in the slightly unusual role of being the convener of a committee that no one wanted to exist, and no one wants to exist for any longer than is necessary. The COVID-19 Committee was created to scrutinise the wide range of mainly expedited legislation necessary to address the impact of coronavirus. And it was within that remit that the committee carried out its Stage 1 scrutiny of this bill yesterday. And can I at the outset just put on record my thanks to our committee clerks who worked so hard in a very short space of time to support the committee in its work. Can I thank Spice for their briefing? Can I thank all the other parliamentary staff who have assisted, particularly those in broadcasting and in dealing with the technology required for the committee to meet virtually. And can I also thank my colleagues, both for the collegiate way in which they've approached the legislation and the working of the committee, but also for their patience and understanding as we grapple with the technology required to make these virtual meetings work. Most of the time successfully, I should say. Now, the bill before us proposes a range of measures. It seeks to make adjustments to laws which protect individuals to ensure their effective operation during the coronavirus outbreak. It makes adjustments to criminal procedure and to other aspects of the justice system to ensure that essential justice business can continue to be disposed of throughout the period of the coronavirus outbreak. And it makes a range of provisions designed to ensure that business and public services can continue to operate effectively during a period when controls on movements have been imposed and when pressures on public services are acute. The committee took evidence from the Law Society of Scotland and from the Cabinet Secretary on the provisions in the bill yesterday and then reported its views. Can I thank the Law Society of Scotland for giving evidence to us less than 24 hours after the bill was published, and I should at this point remind members that I am a member of the Law Society. Now, to summarise our conclusions, Presiding Officer, the committee recommends that Parliament agrees to the general principles of the bill. And I'll say a little bit more about some of the issues that we touched on when we took evidence. In committee yesterday, we asked why this bill is necessary, given the decisions governments across the UK have taken to ease some of the previous restrictions. As the Cabinet Secretary explained, despite changes in lockdown restrictions in Scotland, there remain major disruptions to everyday life. These are likely to continue for some time, and therefore this bill is necessary to require adjustments to the way we operate. It was good to hear that the Scottish Government does not envisage bringing forward any further emergency COVID-19 bills, although we expect there may well be a justice-related bill in relation to jury trials. This will, however, depend upon the outcome of the current judiciary-led group that is considering this issue. One of the key issues throughout the bill is whether it achieves the right balance in responding to the pandemic whilst not unreasonably impacting on people's human rights. The Scottish Government explains in its policy memorandum that it is satisfied that all of the measures contained in the bill are appropriate and proportionate, but it recognises that many are far-reaching and unprecedented. The Law Society considered that overall the bill does strike the right balance in terms of its impact on human rights, while seeking to address the impact of COVID-19. To help achieve that balance, the bill also includes some of the same safeguards included within its predecessor. Part 1 of the bill has a built-in time limit of 30th September 2020, which can be extended by approval of the Parliament for a maximum duration of 18 months. And this ensures Parliament will have its say on whether the powers are being used appropriately and whether they should be extended. The committee also welcomed the requirement for Scottish ministers to keep Part 1 of the bill under review and to report every 2 months on their assessment of the need for the bill, whether parts of the bill remain in use and how the powers have been used. This builds on a similar commitment contained in the first Coronavirus Scotland Act. The committee looks forward to considering the reports that will come forward and working with the Cabinet Secretary as they develop. I would also note that the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee highlighted to us in its letter that it would be beneficial in the interest of effective security if the Scottish Government would review and report to the Scottish Parliament on all subordinate legislation made in response to the coronavirus emergency, whether made under provisions of the Scottish Coronavirus Act or this bill we have before us today. As the lockdown restrictions continue, the impact on the viability of many businesses will increase. The bill therefore makes proposals aimed at making bankruptcy easier for those who need it by reducing or removing application fees and increasing the maximum level of debt covered by the process, including removing student debt from the calculation. The bill also makes it harder for creditors to make individuals bankrupt by raising the minimum amount that must be owed before the creditor can go to court. The Scottish Government considers that these proposals were fair and proportionate. It would be helpful, therefore, for the committee to understand how the revised figures in the bill were arrived at in order to understand how this view was reached. Presiding Officer, one area of discussion in the committee, which the Cabinet Secretary has already referred to, was the question of whether the bill needed to provide greater clarity on whether marriage ceremonies could now take place, particularly but not exclusively, in the end-of-life circumstances that the Cabinet Secretary referred to. I think we welcome the clarification the Cabinet Secretary provided yesterday that in certain exceptional circumstances, such as end-of-life, or where one partner may be leaving the country for work, marriages can take place subject to registrars waiving certain conditions. We support the decision to issue further guidance currently being considered by the National Records of Scotland and the Scottish Government, and I welcome what the Cabinet Secretary had to say about this a few moments ago. This should help provide greater clarity for the public. And I think it would be helpful also if we had some further clarification regarding the extent to which, if these powers already exist, marriages and civil partnerships in exceptional circumstances are in fact already happening, and whether the public are aware of these powers. We should also remember, of course, not everyone is in an exceptional circumstance who wants to get married. There are people who, for other good reasons, perhaps religious reasons, who want to get married, and I do not think we should forget about their situation. Finally, Presiding Officer, while many of the changes proposed in both the First Act and the second Coronavirus Scotland Bill have been made to address negative impacts from the current pandemic, the committee recognises that some could be good practices that continue in the longer term. However, because of the truncated process that's gone into this bill, it would be wrong just to continue these without further consultation and, if appropriate, new legislation. And to this end, we recommend that further consultation and post-legislative scrutiny of the coronavirus legislation is essential once the emergency situation is over to help inform any such decisions. So can I just close, Presiding Officer, by thanking again all my colleagues and those who assisted the committee. We will proceed, assuming the bill passes at stage 1, to stage 2 and 3 next week, when we will consider amendments at that stage. But for now, I'm pleased to support the general principles of the bill. Thank you.
Now call on Adam Tompkins for up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Here we are again for the third successive time debating emergency legislation that responds to the coronavirus crisis. And let me say straight away that we will be supporting the general principles of this bill at decision time this afternoon, but I don't like it. I don't like it at all. So let me go back to the beginning to set my grumpiness in a little context. On the 24th of March, we gave our consent to the UK's coronavirus bill, and Westminster duly passed that legislation with, I think, no more than 4 days debate and scrutiny. A week later, on the 1st of April, we passed our own coronavirus Scotland bill through all its stages here in a single day. And here we are again, as I say, for the third time. Together, and as the Cabinet Secretary recognised, these pieces of legislation are all part of the same overall package. This body of emergency law enacts an extraordinary curtailment of our most fundamental and hitherto cherished rights and liberties. I think it was Willie Rennie who said in one of our earlier debates that he looks forward to the day when all of this can be repealed, and so do I. I'm sure we all do. But, Presiding Officer, it's not just the unprecedented incursion into rights and liberties that should give us pause, it's also the very fact of legislating in a hurry. If we have learned anything in the last few days about the management of the coronavirus crisis, surely it is that we need to think things through. I appreciate that, unlike the last bill, today's legislation is to be enacted in a week rather than in a single day. But what we lose when we legislate in a hurry like this is the time to think. To think not only about what's in the bill, but also what's not in the bill. The time to think about amendments, the time to consult, the time to build coalitions of support. This is a parliament of minorities, after all. None of us here can do anything without seeking and obtaining the support of others, and that takes time. So I make no apology for being grumpy. Now, I recognise that within these unwelcome constraints, the Cabinet Secretary has tried to do his best, and I thank him for that. He did reach out, as this bill was being prepared, to other parties to seek their input. And he has put in place in this bill the same procedural checks and safeguards as are already contained in the earlier coronavirus legislation that we have passed. All of this is welcome and to be commended. I also welcome what the Cabinet Secretary told the COVID Scrutiny Committee yesterday, that this is intended to be the last piece of emergency legislation Scottish ministers bring to the Parliament in response to the coronavirus crisis. I do want to reflect, though, Presiding Officer, on three matters, the first of which has already been touched on by both the Cabinet Secretary and the convener of the committee, and that is the right to marry. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only MSP in receipt of an increasing amount of correspondence from constituents who are increasingly anxious about not being able to get married or to make plans to get married. Now, we all understand why large wedding parties cannot go ahead as normal at the moment, but as I understand it, only 5 people need to be present for a lawful marriage to take place. The 2 parties, the registrar, and 2 witnesses. There are hundreds of locations across Scotland where gatherings as small as that can safely take place whilst observing social distancing at all times. And as the Cabinet Secretary recorded in his remarks, I raised this matter with him yesterday in committee, and he has since written to the committee, and I thank him for his letter, explaining that there is no legal ban or bar on marriages at the moment in Scotland, but that as a matter of practice, registrars are not issuing marriage licences or don't appear to be issuing marriage licences because they are prioritising their work regarding the registration of deaths. And to this I would just gently point out, both to him and to the Registrar General, that the right to marry is exactly that, a right. Indeed, it is a fundamental human right enshrined in Article 12 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And as such, its exercise should be denied to people only where there is a pressing social need to do so. Disproportionate interferences with the exercise of the right to marry will be unlawful. Now, there are circumstances, sometimes very sad circumstances, where the right to marry needs to be exercised quickly, such as where one of the parties is at or near the end of life. The Cabinet Secretary has explained in his letter that the 28-day notice period, and he said this in his remarks, normally required for a marriage licence can be waived in exceptional circumstances. So perhaps the Cabinet Secretary is right that there does not need to be a change in the law to facilitate marriages in the time of coronavirus. But at the least, there does need to be a change of perception, both amongst members of the public and, I would say, among registrars. And the Cabinet Secretary has said in his letter, and I quote, that there is a need to ensure, that there is a need to ensure public understanding of what is possible with regard to marriage ceremonies. And I agree. And I'm raising these matters now, I think largely as he did in his remarks, in order to shine some parliamentary light on them in the hope that we can move to a position where more marriages can take place lawfully and, of course, safely. And in that spirit, I warmly welcome what the Cabinet Secretary had to say about this matter in his opening remarks. Happy to give way to Pauline McNeill.
Pauline McNeill.
I'm very grateful to Adam Tompkins, and I support 100% what he said. I think he brought something really important to the Chamber. Would the member agree that obviously people marry for love, but there's important consequences, legal consequences, should anything happen to your partner and you're not married and you've missed out on the chance to be married?
Adam Tompkins.
Absolutely, I fully agree with that, which is why I think it's recognised that this is not just a privilege or an interest, but a fundamental right that we have. And the same goes for this right as for all other rights that we are trampling all over in our attempt to suppress the spread of the coronavirus. That the interferences with these rights must be justified in the public interest, and that is the way in which we have to approach all of these matters. The second matter I want to reflect on in the time I have left, Presiding Officer, is freedom of information. In last month's coronavirus bill, there were vigorous exchanges in this chamber and a series of knife-edge votes decided in the end on the casting vote of the presiding officer about the Scottish Government's proposals to exempt themselves from the ordinary rules of freedom of information, giving themselves and other public authorities much longer to respond to requests for information than the law normally stipulates. Yesterday, in what was, I have to say, a high-quality debate with outstanding contributions from right across the chamber, it is notable that every single opposition MSP who spoke argued that the Scottish Government needs to be more transparent with us and with the public in the manner in which they are handling the coronavirus crisis. Whether that's transparency about the R number, transparency about failures in care homes, or transparency about what happened at that Nike conference earlier in the year. Presiding Officer, the way we have left our freedom of information laws after last month's bill left a sour taste in the mouth and is deeply unsatisfactory. And I give notice that I intend to bring amendments at stage 2 of this bill that will seek to put that right. At a time like this, there is neither justification nor excuse for ministers to seek to shield themselves from the glare of openness and transparency. Finally, Presiding Officer, 2 procedural points which are bothering me. The first is that we are agreed, all of us, that emergency legislation may be necessary to deal with a public emergency. But not all of the provisions of this new bill do deal directly with public emergency. Some go beyond it to make other changes which, whilst perhaps innocent and no doubt expedient, are not strictly required by the emergency we face. The new bill, for example, makes changes to legislation regarding what is now to be next year's UEFA Football Championship. The changes are admittedly minor, but I do just want to make the point that it is not appropriate to use emergency legislation to make changes to policy that do not pertain to the emergency in question and that are not strictly required by it. And lastly, Presiding Officer, I want to underscore a point made by the Delegated Powers Committee that Murdo Fraser has already referred to. We know that this bill, the Coronavirus Act 2020 and the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020, each enact safeguards, including reporting requirements and sunset provisions. And these are important safeguards. However, by no means all of the secondary legislation made by ministers in connection with coronavirus have been made under these acts. Much of it's been made under other legislation, meaning that the safeguards as to reporting requirements and sunsetting will not apply. I note the recommendation of the Delegated Powers Committee that, at the least, Scottish Government should report regularly to this Parliament on all provisions relating to the coronavirus crisis, not only on those made under the emergency legislation. And this is another matter which I think can usefully be considered at stage 2. But first, we have to get through stage 1, and as I have indicated, subject to these reservations, Presiding Officer, we will be supporting the general principles of this bill this afternoon.
Now call Alex Rowley for 7 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, in opening for Labour today, I want to acknowledge the ongoing cooperation with the Government in addressing the COVID crisis. And I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the inclusive approach he has taken to this and other legislation being brought forward in this Parliament. We will support this bill today at stage 1. I believe the public expect all of us in this chamber to work together in the best interests of our country during this crisis and in the best interests of the people, and that is the right thing to do. Can I also say that as we move through this uncertain period, there may well be a need for further legislation, and where that is the case, we will continue to work with the Government to make it happen. Yesterday, the Deputy First Minister confirmed that the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture is working with employers and trade unions to put in place guidance and a framework for safe working. While we need to see the outcomes from that work, I also believe we need to see a massive expansion of health and safety reps into workplaces across the country, and if that or any other aspect of safe working and a safe working framework needs to be put into law, then we will be willing to do so and do so at pace. I was very disappointed on Sunday as I read the change of message from the UK Government and the even more confused national address from the Prime Minister on Sunday evening. So it is important that we do all we can to avoid confusing messages, but it is difficult when the Westminster Government breaks rank and goes off in a separate direction. As such, I do think it's important that this Parliament makes clear that we are at one with the Government of Scotland when it comes to how we move forward, stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives. And it will also be important that we make sure that as we move forward with supporting workers to get back to work, there are clear rules and guidance in place and all health and safety laws apply. This is why I'm asking the Government to explore further the role of health and safety reps in workplaces, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary will take that on board. This year, the theme for International Workers' Memorial Day on the 28th April was fittingly coronavirus, and the TUC reminded us of the importance of health and safety in the workplace, where they said we could not have a starker reminder of the important role of trade union health and safety reps in saving and protecting workers' lives than the current crisis that we are living through. So, as I say, I am asking the Cabinet Secretary to take this issue on board and look at a massive expansion of health and safety representatives across our country. Given the speed of legislation, it is also vital to pick up concerns and issues that have been flagged up to us. And in fairness to the Cabinet Secretary, many of the measures in this bill before us today have been flagged up by individuals and organisations. Shelter Scotland have welcomed the changes being brought in by this bill, which will allow students to terminate their current student accommodation tenancy by giving 7 days notice. Shelter Scotland say student accommodation providers must provide maximum flexibility in these unprecedented times, and these proposed changes will ensure protection for all students who cannot remain in their student residential accommodation during the coronavirus pandemic. The Law Society of Scotland state that compliance with European Convention of Human Rights means that legislative change must be lawful, necessary, proportionate, time-limited and non-discriminatory. They go on to say that they welcome the respect for human rights in the policy memorandum, and in highlighting some particular features, they make clear that close post-legislative scrutiny of how the Act works in practice will be crucial. I agree with that. But I would want to put on record, Presiding Officer, our thanks to the Law Society for the support and advice, impartial advice they provide all year round, but in particular at this time where there is less time to scrutinise sometimes difficult and complex legislation. I do accept, Presiding Officer, that in this crisis lessons will need to be learned as we make progress. So the lesson, for example, from this week in terms of the hotel in Edinburgh and the night conference must be that no one can come into Scotland through our airports unless they are tested and quarantined for 14 days. So we will learn, and we need to learn where mistakes are made. And that does highlight why the Scottish Government have been right to insist on all nations of the UK working together, and why the UK Government must learn the lessons of this week and think before they act, and only do so in partnership with all nations and administrations of the United Kingdom. In conclusion, I want to make clear that in this crisis it is right that opposition members, indeed I would argue all members in this chamber, have a duty to hold the government to account where there are weaknesses, where there are gaps and where things must move at a faster pace. This is not simply to criticise, but to make sure we get a difficult situation right with party politics put to one side. That said, we must also recognise the enormity of the challenges and support ministers as they face up to those challenges. I asked a question of the Government 4 weeks ago that, in light of Scotland's established life science sector, for what reason it's not making greater use of the expertise in our universities and research institute labs throughout the country to increase the testing capacity of COVID-19. We are not using all the capacity in our Scottish labs to test. We have not got testing and tracking anywhere near the levels that it should be at. And that is my final point, Presiding Officer. The measures in this bill are just part of a widespread approach, and we need every bit of that approach to be working. We all have a duty to work together to make that happen. Thank you.
I call Andy Whiteman for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Scottish Greens support the general principles of the bill and will be voting for it. My focus this afternoon will be on what can and should be added to the bill. We're particularly pleased, of course, with the provisions on student accommodation after having lodged amendments in the first bill on this matter, and are glad that human rights concerns have been resolved. Proposals now, as the Minister mentioned, allow students to terminate existing contracts with 7 days notice and cancel new ones with 28. And I'd like to thank the National Union of Students, many members of the Scottish Youth Parliament for their work in securing this. But before proceeding, Presiding Officer, I want to raise an important point about this and the previous bill, and the Cabinet Secretary did mention this as well. Both bills are emergency bills. Both expire by the automatic rule of law on either 30th September 2020 or 31st March 2021, if not terminated sooner by regulation. However, as we now know, this pandemic is not only affecting people during the crisis, it will have impacts beyond the emergency period. For example, on indebtedness, that's going to be very obvious, I think, and importantly on housing. And our contention is that these impacts are COVID impacts and they will need to be addressed. Housing has always been a public health issue, and today, as we continue to stay at home, people need greater security to allow them to plan for the future and deal with any financial difficulties that many are or will be facing. So Greens will therefore be bringing forward amendments at stage 2 on housing that relate to the post-emergency period. These will ensure that any arrears as a consequence of COVID-19 can never be grounds for eviction in future. To introduce a tenant hardship fund to balance the landlord hardship fund developed by the Tories and the SNP. And most critically, tenants will continue to face hardship over the coming months and years as a result of already high rents and reduced incomes. So we will be lodging an amendment to introduce a rent freeze for 2 years following the expiry of the emergency period to give tenants some limited certainty in a world so full of uncertainty. Presiding Officer, we also want to ensure that women's right to access reproductive health care is not curtailed by the crisis. We want to give pharmacists the ability to issue contraceptive pills free of charge, bringing Scotland in line with England. Currently, they can only be accessed free of charge with a prescription from a GP. And so this proposal is very much in line with the Scottish Government's own advice, indeed, that couples should think seriously about whether or not they should start a family during the pandemic. The Scottish Government have already extended the minor ailment service for the period of the pandemic, and our proposal is the contraceptive pill be issued through this service. Many women are at higher risk of domestic abuse, including coercive control, than at the present time. And ensuring that they have the greatest possible access to contraception is an important part of providing support through the crisis. Presiding Officer, one of the known impacts of the virus is that we will require to physically distance for many months in the future. Plans are already taking place across Scotland in cities, particularly to redesign the road space to accommodate safely cycling and walking. Now, when restrictions are lifted, we face an enormous risk of a major increase in car use and a resulting congestion and air pollution. Before the pandemic, as my colleague Alison Johnson highlighted at FMQs today, thousands, the same order of magnitude as are dying from COVID, thousands were already dying as a result of air pollution. And so we're a little bit disappointed to see no measures in the bill to address this issue, although we accept that maybe they're not required, but we're keen to explore that. Because councils will be investing millions in making our streets safer, and we must make it easier for councils to make these changes more permanent. On education, there are ongoing challenges for students who have now received their final SAS payment. But the summer work, which many depend on, will almost certainly not exist. Now, the National Union of Students has said there is a ticking time bomb of student deprivation. Summer is the period in which dropouts spike due to financial pressures in a normal year, We support the Scottish Government's hardship fund, but it's administered by colleges and universities. And what we need is a more systematic increase in student support, for example, an extension of SAS payments over the summer. And universal credit, of course, is the only alternative for many students. And as ministers are well aware, the problems with that system, not least the 5-week waiting time, are significant. Happy to do so briefly.
Neil Findlay.
Our final minute, so Mr Tompkins raised the issue about FOI, and I understand Mr Whiteman was not happy with the way that FOI proceeded in the previous legislation. I wonder if the Greens would support amendments coming forward to repeal the restrictions on FOI that were in the last bill.
Andy White.
Thank you, Mr Findlay. The short answer is yes. So, Presiding Officer, what's clear is that this deadly virus is going to be around for some considerable period to come. We welcome the Government's emergency bill to make further adjustments to the law in order to deal with the impacts of COVID-19. But we're also clear now, in a way we weren't when the first bill was passed, that we now need to think beyond strictly the emergency period to ongoing impacts that are COVID-19 impacts that will continue to affect people's lives beyond the expiry of this bill. And thus there is a strong case for making provisions now that will give some confidence and certainty to Scotland's tenants in particular to ensure that the human right to housing is not compromised by a legislative framework that never anticipated the crisis we're now living through. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also start by thanking the Scottish Government, in particular Mike Russell, for the inclusive manner that has characterised both the first emergency bill of this crisis and this one. And I assure him of our support of the general principles. Can I echo some of Andy Whiteman's excellent comments there, particularly around women's reproductive health and indeed student accommodation? I think issues that have materialised, and they will not be alone in things that we have to, as this Parliament, deal with. Can I commend the Government and civil servants for the quick turnaround in this bill, and it is very well written. There is only a few areas that we would seek to slightly amend, and I hope that, with the exception of one, these will prove uncontroversial. The first of these covers the additional dwelling supplement. We would like to extend the time frame from 27 months to 36 months, bringing it into line with provisions in England. The ADS, of course, came into force in 2016 via the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Act. In 2016, my colleague Liam MacArthur raised concerns about the fear that 18-month threshold will, in his words, prove particularly problematic in places like Orkney and could adversely affect the local market. Housing market in Orkney and other island communities operates differently to other parts of mainland Scotland. Properties can remain on the market for prolonged periods of time, often extending beyond 18 months. At the time, Derek Mackay said that provisions hadn't been in place long enough to be reconsidered. Liam asked for an island's impact assessment in May 2019, but Kate Forbes said she didn't consider a change necessary. This tax has a specific purpose: to protect the interests of first-time buyers who want to enter into the Scottish property market. At the moment, though, people who have a genuine interest in selling their old home and are making every effort to do so are being caught by the exceptionally slow market. This is not the point of the tax. An extension of the time frame would provide breathing space for those who are trying to sell up in areas which will move even more slowly. And given that we just don't know how the property market is going to react to the coronavirus crisis, that breathing space could make all the difference. The second area we would like to explore by amendment covers loopholes that have appeared through our support for business. Eligibility for that support is currently linked to the non-domestic rate system. Each of us will know businesses in our own communities that have fallen through the cracks. One particular concern is the qualification date set by the government of 17th of March. Some businesses may have sublet their operation for a short period of time so that their tenant stands to benefit from the whole grant, as was the case in my constituency for the Queensferry Motor Company, whose owner had to sublet the business for 3 months but was due to take occupancy at the start of May. He will miss out on this business saving grant. Of additional concern is the issue of those who do not pay business rates to the council but do so indirectly as part of a management charge or rental agreement to a management company or factor. Many companies operating in the Gyle industrial estate in my constituency occupy serviced office space. Their business rate liability exists but is factored into the fee that they pay to the company that manages that space. So we shall seek to explore how we might close these loopholes by amendment. Presiding Officer, these are areas that I hope the Government will look kindly on and work with us to resolution. The one I fear will be met with controversy has been mentioned several times, and that is around freedom of information and the information of FOI sections of the first bill. On any normal day, Presiding Officer, the rejection of any proposal by all 4 opposition parties in this chamber would have spelled the end of it. That would reflect the decision and settled will of the Scottish electorate in the 2016 election. But the balance of votes in the chamber on April the 1st was askew, and the result was distorted. It prompted Catherine Styler from the Open Knowledge Foundation to point out, and I quote, that Scotland is now in the unenviable position of being the first country in the whole of the world to introduce new restrictions on freedom of information as a result of the coronavirus outbreak. In the days afterward, the BBC called for the official count of the number of suspected cases of COVID-19 in care homes, something already being given to councils, health boards and the government. But the Care Inspectorate told them that the request was being treated as an FOI, meaning it had 3 months to respond. Now, we know that the Health Secretary resolved this, but a robust system should not need the good grace of its ministers. As a surveyation poll of the Open Knowledge organisation found that 52% of respondents believe that restricting the public's right to information is an unnecessary measure in this emergency. To have asked so I have also asked clerks, and I'm quite willing to withdraw those instructions and work with Adam Tompkins and other parties to repeal those previous sections of the emergency bill. And I want to use this to spark a properly balanced discussion and a vote on what the system should be for the duration of this pandemic. Ross Greer and Neil Finlay puts forward some of those options in our previous discussions. Last time around, we only had minutes to talk this through. This time we have a week or more to agree alternatives. And I invite ministers to convene these talks now. Listen to what you have heard. The unanimity across these opposition benches that today will ask you to go and think again on the provisions around time limits for freedom of information. Presiding Officer, as Liberals, we have sought at every stage in this emergency to ensure that Scotland's liberal values are retained throughout the whole of this emergency, whether that be in jury trials or whether it be in freedom of information. And for those reasons, we hope that we will persuade government to adopt these changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to the open debate, and I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Miles Briggs. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be called to speak in the Stage 1 debate this afternoon on the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill. I, in fact, sit on the Parliament's COVID-19 committee, and as a member of that committee, I too would like at the outset to thank the clerks for the tremendous amount of work that they have carried out, and in such a short space of time in order to meet the tight deadlines of this emergency legislation. I thank Spice as well, and I also particularly thank Broadcasting and IT, who are very patient indeed with people who are not hugely technically skilled. As we have heard, assuming that the principles of the bill are agreed tonight, which looks likely to be the case, we will see a virtual Stage 2 committee meeting next Tuesday, which I believe is a first for this Parliament in terms at least of primary legislation. So I'm sure all the committee members and clerks are up for the challenge, and we'll see how all that transpires. It seems from what members have said that there might be quite a few amendments to be scrutinised. And of course we have Stage 3 next Wednesday, and then a fast-tracked Royal Assent process has been requested thereafter. In considering the bill, the first question that we must ask as a Parliament is whether there is a need for the legislation to be introduced and to be dealt with on this emergency basis. And for my part, Presiding Officer, the clear underlying rationale for the bill is a recognition that we are in this for the long haul, that we therefore need to plan ahead, that we need to act prudently and with caution, and that we need to facilitate the continuing functioning of our society whilst we strive to arrive at the new normal, whatever that will be and whenever that will be. I believe that the provisions in the bill reflect these imperatives, and I would now like to turn to some of the matters covered with a view to also reflecting on their appropriateness and proportionality. Firstly, I very much welcome the provision in the bill which would allow for the first time for the backdating of any further rates relief that may be introduced. This would permit The Scottish Government, if it were to introduce further business rates relief for the financial year 2021, to propose that that relief be backdated to April 2020. I think this would be of significant benefit to business, and I look forward to hearing from the Scottish Government what plans they may have in this respect. Another key provision of the bill would be to make a special coronavirus carers allowance supplement of £230.10. That is to be in addition to the two other carers allowance supplements that were already due to be paid this year in that amount. Thus, if the bill were to pass, this would be paid next month automatically to all those in receipt of carers allowance. And such a special supplement, as the Cabinet Secretary has said, recognises the tremendous pressures on unpaid carers, particularly in light of the pandemic. And I'm sure that this special supplement would be very much welcomed. In terms of our justice system, there are a number of important areas covered by the bill, including the issue of proceeds of crime confiscation orders. Under the bill, the coronavirus would be deemed to be an exceptional circumstance, such that the timing of confiscation order proceedings could be extended if they were impacted directly or indirectly by the pandemic. This reflects the practical difficulties at this time in progressing confiscation orders and will ensure that the prospect of recovery of proceeds of crime is not hindered. And I understand from our Stage 1 evidence session yesterday in committee that the Crown Office had in fact raised this issue themselves, as they were concerned that, for example, investigation orders could not be routinely considered by the court at this time in light of the need both for Crown and defence agents to attend in person. A concomitant provision in the bill in Schedule 2 Part 2 would see time limits also extended for the individual subject to the confiscation order in terms of time to pay. This reflects the current difficulties in, for example, realising assets such as heritable property. I know that the recovery of proceeds of crime in Scotland has been to date a huge success story, and I am pleased, therefore, to see that the significant efforts of the Crown and of Police Scotland in this regard will not be undermined as a result of the pandemic. Presiding Officer, there are many other important issues covered by the bill, but I'm conscious that my time is moving on, and I think what I would say on the issues that I have raised as a representative sample of the kind of issues that are being dealt with, technical issues in many regards, but I think it is evident that these are appropriate and these are proportionate. And I would like to end by making reference to the important issue of safeguards. I believe that, there has been established the need for the legislation, and I also believe that it is evidently appropriate and proportionate. And therefore, I think as parliamentarians, the other key issue that we have to look at in terms of emergency legislation is if there are sufficient safeguards in place. And in this respect, it should be noted that, of course, the Coronavirus No.1 Act, in that legislation, and just like that legislation, the operative provisions of this bill will expire on 30 September 2020, with 2 possible further periods of extension only if approved by the Parliament. There is also a requirement on the Scottish Government, as we have heard, to provide reports on the legislation every 2 months. And I was pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary's, Michael Russell's comments in that regard, looking at ways to involve the Chamber and the COVID-19 Committee in scrutinising those reports. And I look forward to further detail on that. And of course, in addition to those opportunities for scrutiny, there is the important role of post-legislative scrutiny as well. And therefore, I believe that the safeguards are in place. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am content to agree to the principles of the bill at Stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Miles Briggs to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Scottish Conservatives recognise the need for many of the elements of this legislation as the Scottish Government seeks to continue to deal with the consequences of the COVID-19 public health emergency and its impact on individuals, public services, businesses and our economy. I want to focus my initial comments today on the bill's proposal of extra financial support for carers, something I've been calling for from the start of the crisis, and I welcome the positive engagement by Shirley and Somerville on this. And I want to start by paying tribute to the carers in my Lothian region and across Scotland, whether paid or unpaid, who have worked so hard during this pandemic to look after some of the most vulnerable people in our society, many of whom are the highest risk. Carers play a very important and vital role in our society and often are forgotten as we look towards the role that they play. I hope this legislation will really make the difference we need to see for them. I know from speaking to carers and carers organisations in my region that the extra support offered in this bill on top of the carers allowance supplement is welcome, and Scottish Conservatives support it. I hope ministers will also consider to engage with carers during this time and their representative organisations as we go forward, and will continue to look at possible additional measures to support them. I'd make a further plea today that around the restarting and development of respite services and carers breaks as well. This is an area I've written to the Cabinet Secretary on today, as it's something I believe we need to see also given a priority. For many of our fellow Scots who have not had respite care during this period, it's something they urgently want to see taken forward. I hope that's something which can be looked at. Yes.
Shirley Ann Summer.
To thank Miles Briggs for giving me the opportunity to say that the Cabinet Secretary for Health and I have spoken about this exact issue. It's clearly an area which it refers to some of the aspects the First Minister brought up today. We do need to bear in mind the vulnerability of some of the people who may be using those respite facilities as well, but it is something that's under active consideration in the priorities that the First Minister mentioned.
Well, I welcome that clarity, and I hope we'll be able to hear as soon as possible how that can be taken forward. Since the outbreak of this crisis, I've had a number of students at Edinburgh University contact me with their concerns about being unable to exit leases for student accommodation, and therefore welcome the legislative proposals in this area. It's right that they should be able to exit their leases, and I'm pleased that additional provision is being made in the legislation for students who may be entering accommodation in the coming academic year. These measures have rightly been welcomed by student representative groups. I've also raised with the Scottish Government a number of constituency cases where people face being unable to claim back additional dwelling supplement, and I'm also welcoming the common sense proposals in that area today. With many small and retail businesses continuing to struggle, notwithstanding the support schemes that have already been introduced, and fearful of the future, it's appropriate that the bill gives ministers the powers to set new rate reliefs and backdate these to the 1st of April 2020. And we await further detail of what ministers have planned in regard to this. While much of this bill is welcome, Scottish Conservatives do have some concerns about the number of aspects, particularly in relation to justice proposals, which my colleague Liam Kerr will outline later. Ministers have also failed to make the adequate case for why it's necessary to delay the publication of data that's vital to our fight against climate change, and something this delay of publication of their annual accounts as well. Officials are presumably still working on these subjects and in a position to provide these updates to Parliament, and we believe it's essential that we're able to still be able to scrutinise the government's spending as they progress in these areas. And I have to say, personally, I've become concerned at the consistent delays to ministers answering written questions for a number of weeks. To pick up on Adam Tompkins' grumpiness earlier, and finally, I wanted to express reservations at the Cabinet Secretary's intention to bring forward a government amendment to stage 2 of the bill next week in relation to powers to purchase care homes. This move has already created concern and distraction in the care sector in Scotland at a very time that we're seeing coronavirus engulfing many care homes. All our priority must be in delivering the safe and quality care that people living in care homes desperately need. In the middle of a pandemic, for care home staff across Scotland to start worrying about the future of their jobs or the future viability of the homes which they work in is something none of us will want to see. I've also seen nothing in the way of consultation with the independent and charitable sector on this proposal. Jean Freeman has said she wants to work in partnership with the care sector in Scotland. Instead, this move by ministers risks creating a negative relationship, and that's something I hope ministers will recognise. I'm not sure I'll have the time. Yeah?
Alex Riley.
Yeah, I heard what you said there about care staff being very worried in terms of the future of the jobs. Does he agree that care home staff right across Scotland are absolutely terrified right now going to their work, and that's the issue that we need to ensure is tackled?
Miles Briggs.
I absolutely do, and that's why by now we should have had a timetable when all care home staff will have been tested in Scotland. We know that people are testing asymptomatic to COVID-19 and working in care homes still. So it's something we should have seen addressed way before now. But the point I was making is SNP ministers admit that they already have common law powers to enter into agreements with the charitable and independent care providers to purchase financially struggling care homes. And we support that. But the Cabinet Secretary has made no effort to reach out to opposition spokesmen on this issue, and by not putting the amendment here today at stage 1 of the bill is clearly not giving Parliament the full opportunity to scrutinise the proposal, given the rapid speed of this legislation. Will I have time, Deputy Presiding Officer?
Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell.
Thank you. As I have not seen the amendment, as the member has not seen the amendment, could I suggest two things? One is that we wait to see the amendment, and secondly, not to make the assumption that amendments at stage 2 are inherently wrong. I think there will be many amendments at stage 2, some of which will come from the Conservatives. I do not assume they are inherently wrong. I don't think they should assume that that is the case for any amendment until we've seen it, and certainly not to stir up fears about an amendment without having seen the detail of it.
Miles Briggs.
Well, Mr Russell has outlined in the past his concern at the unintended consequences of poor legislation, and I agree with that. I fear this amendment could be a prime example of ministers not engaging and listening to these concerns. So we will take that forward. But if the charitable or independent homes are expressing concerns and wanting to make sure this is not something which will negatively impact on the sector, I think that's important that we raise these concerns in this Parliament. The care sector in Scotland is facing a critical and uncertain future. It needs help and support, not yet more uncertainty. To conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, I welcome large parts of this bill and believe it's correct that ministers are putting these measures in place. I hope that the Scottish Government will look again at a number of particular proposals and which members across this chamber have expressed concern today, and consider removing or revising these as we move to the next stages of the bill next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Willie Coffey to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Willie Coffey.
Presiding Officer, thank you. I'm pleased to be able to speak in this really important Stage 1 debate on the proposals to further protect the people of Scotland from consequences arising as a result of this health emergency. We had a really good online evidence session yesterday with Michael Clancy and Gillian Maudsley from the Law Society, and then followed, of course, by the Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell, taking questions from the members in the new COVID-19 committee. The Law Society has kindly provided a brief for us that covers most of the topics in the bill, and I'm grateful to them for doing this at so late a stage in the day yesterday. There are a number of areas covered in the bill dealing with bankruptcy, student accommodation, criminal justice, proceeds of crime, help for carers, and changes to the land and buildings transaction tax. It seeks to introduce protections for individuals who, through no fault or action on their part, may find themselves in difficult circumstances, financial or otherwise, as a result of the health emergency and regulations now in force. My interest initially was to ask Mr Clancy about the basic principles that underpin any legislation and whether these still applied in this case, where we are having to expedite legislation in a far tighter timescale than we would normally be comfortable with. And what, of course, were the safeguards for the public in a process such as this? Those basic principles that any law should be clear, coherent, effective and accessible, and that it works in practice, all should still apply even in these circumstances. And that fundamental protections for people on equality and human rights must remain in place. Mr Clancy and the Law Society welcomed a number of provisions in the bill which engage the European Convention on Human Rights, and explained that it was even more important to do so when legislating for emergency laws. Other more obvious safeguards are the review periods where the Scottish Government will review and report progress with the bill, as well as the automatic expiry of many of the provisions, with none of the measures in Part 1 of the bill lasting longer than September 21. And possibly lastly, it's important that the Parliament feels that it's been able to scrutinise the bill in some detail, and I would imagine our Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee might take the opportunity to look at how it has performed when we get the chance to do so in the future. Presiding Officer, I was happy to see the proposals relating to protecting our students, many of whom have been particularly disadvantaged because of the outbreak of the virus. It has meant most have gone home now, but who are still required to pay for their accommodation that many other members have mentioned, but they were unable to use. Those students who are in halls of residence or purpose-built accommodation have no right to terminate their tenancy agreements and sadly, many of them are still being forced to pay for it. The Cabinet Secretary, giving evidence to the committee yesterday, confirmed that it was the Government's intention to introduce a 7-day notice period for students who are currently tied into tenancies and a 28-day notice period for agreements that are entered into while the Act is in force. With the universities unable to function and students not able to attend, I think this is a fair and reasonable compromise and will help many students and their families of students at this really difficult time. The Law Society too are supportive of the measure, albeit seeking some clarification about exactly who can serve the notice, especially if it's come about as a result of the virus itself. And it may in fact fall foul of Article 14 of the ECHR, which deals with discrimination towards people who are enduring similar circumstances. Just a little word or two, Presiding Officer, about to welcome the proposals in relation to the proposal in the bill to award a payment of around £230 to the carers allowance recipients this June, which is to be paid on top of the carers allowance supplement. This payment will help surely some of our lowest paid carers, nearly 2,500 of them in East Ayrshire alone, who are doing an incredibly difficult but crucial job helping the most vulnerable people in our communities. Presiding Officer, and drawing my brief remarks to a close, I'd just like to comment on the courtesy, respect and concern shown by all of our colleagues on the committees that I'm serving on during this crisis. It's really been very welcome, and I hope we might see some more of that in the Chamber sometime too. Ministers and their officials trying to get us through this, and those who have kindly participated to help us by appearing online to give evidence despite extremely difficult circumstances, has been inspiring, to say the least. It may well be pointing us to our own new normal and how we conduct our business from now on, and that would be no bad thing, I suggest. My last word goes to the World Health Organization's Director General, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who said, "We're all in this together to do the right things with calm and to protect the citizens of the world." Hopefully we can keep this close to our own hearts in the weeks and the months to come. And with that, I'm happy to draw my remarks to a close and support the principles of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Pauline McNeill to be followed by Shona Robertson. Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And firstly, thanks to the committee for the work that they're doing. And I just wanted to also say that yesterday, whilst I wasn't here, I thought that the debate was really excellent, and I commend all the members who spoke in it. I will support the general principles of the bill, but like Andy Whiteman, I think there might be some scope for amendments at stage 2. I agree with others who have said that through this emergency, transparency, honesty, to correct the things that we've done wrong. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but we must learn from any mistakes that we make across the way. I begin by welcoming the provisions where students had been previously forced to pay for their accommodation when they returned home to their families for lockdown. This will go a long way to help students facing financial hardship, and of course students who have lost their jobs in the hospitality sector, many of them not eligible for help through universal credit. So I wholeheartedly welcome that provision. I would, as I said in my intervention in Adam Tompkins' excellent speech, like to highlight that the raising of an issue such as this shows how carefully we need to examine day-to-day damage that's being done to normal life and point out things like that and not overlook them. And I hope that the Minister will listen carefully to what Adam Tompkins has said. We have said in the past, of course, we work with the government for the greater good, but as the opposition, we'll do our job for the greater good as well. But we do all need to anticipate as we can look ahead to see where the crisis might take us. I want to talk about two particular subjects. Firstly, about the impact on women, and secondly, where I think we need to help renters. Women are bearing a lot of the impact of COVID-19. They are overrepresented in professions which are on the front line. We know that women make up the majority of workers in health and social care, and it is a measure of the slow progress we've made in the past on gender segregation and why we must still plan for change in the future. In addition, there's a disproportionate number of black and minority ethnic women working in these sectors, and it is alarming to mention the overall numbers and victims of the virus amongst the BME communities. I do think data should be published so that we can try and understand why this is the case. Scotland is not alone. This seems to be an international trend But I think when looking to provision 6 on the quality impact assessment of the legislation and going forward, I think that that's something that ministers do need to look to so that we know that we're getting a response right. Many women are more likely to have lost their jobs as a result of COVID-19, with newly unemployed women being 17% as against men at 13%. It's early days, but that is the current trend. And for those not made unemployed, the closure of schools has had a huge impact on all parents, but more so on women taking time off work and trying to work from home whilst caring for children. But the most worrying aspect of that is the evidence and incidences of domestic violence, which have increased during the lockdown. According to Police Scotland, the number of requests from people seeking information about whether their partner has been abusive in the past was 18% higher in the first month of the lockdown compared with the same period in 2019. And the number of calls to the Refugees National Domestic Abuse Line was almost double the rate that they would have expected. I'm sure you agree with me, it's quite horrifying to think of women and children trapped in homes that are like pressure cookers. And I think that might not be appropriate in this emergency legislation, Cabinet Secretary, but I do think it's worth considering what more can be done in the short term to give women a way out of this horrendous domestic violence. I want to spend the remaining minutes talking about renters and about fuel poverty. I'm very interested in what Andy Whiteman had to say about the Greens' position on how renters could be helped. I do think we do need to help more renters beyond the freeze in evictions. It's important that tenants are not forced into unmanageable debt during the crisis and beyond it. Otherwise, we will face a massive round of evictions when the freeze on evictions ends. I did raise this with Cabinet Secretary during the passage of the first emergency legislation as to whether or not some national fund might be of use. Obviously, we need to think in detail about who we should be. Yes, I will. Yeah.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank Ms McNeill for giving way, Presiding Officer. As was pointed out in the first debate, we have advised any tenants who have difficulties to go to their landlords in the first instance to see what help is available. We've encouraged folk to sign up to universal credit if that's the right thing to do. But beyond that, we've also expanded the amount of money that's available in direct housing payments. And I would urge folks who have any difficulties to go with those routes, particularly DHPs, if there's nothing else to help them at that moment in time.
Pauline McNeill.
I'm not saying that the government haven't done quite a lot, and you have done quite a lot to help renters. But what I'm arguing is that we might have to go further, and I appreciate we don't know at this stage what that picture is going to look like, but I think we need to anticipate that we might have a massive round of evictions. Not every landlord is going to be that helpful. Many people will find that universal credit either they're not entitled to, and I think this will be acknowledged there might be a gap here, or the housing payment is not large enough. We're urging people to stay at home and not go to work. At the same time, it means that they could be faced with the stress of accumulating rent arrears. And I also want to, in my concluding few seconds, which I think it is, Presiding Officer, to say this is also true in relation to energy. Compare the market shows that the average UK energy bills will increase by something like £32 a month as jobs continue to be furloughed and many lose their livelihoods. I think we need to try and anticipate what the picture looks like. People may need some help from energy companies to pay their debts. And why shouldn't energy companies put something in? Because they're certainly reaping the benefit of it. And I have written to the Big Six asking what 6 energy companies what they propose to do with that. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I do think we need to think of some kind of detail of assessment of who needs help, who those people might be. We need a bigger conversation how to reshape society, not leave people behind. The deep scars of the pandemic are likely to be deep, but with some creative thinking, with some working together, with collective action and some radical inclusive policies, I think we could actually create a better society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Shona Robertson to be followed by Graham Simpson. Shona Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to speak in support of the general principles of this bill and want to also pay tribute to the Clarks, Spice and Broadcasting for their efforts as part of the COVID-19 committee. We're certainly all facing circumstances that we've never faced before. The whole of the Scottish Government is, of course, entirely focused on dealing with the pandemic, whether that's in the day-to-day response or indeed the necessary legislative changes required in responding to the pandemic. And today, we're dealing with a second such piece of legislation in the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill. It's a technical bill, but I want to focus my remarks on a small number of areas covered by the bill. As the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security said earlier, Part 2 of Schedule 1 of the bill provides for an additional carers allowance supplement payment of £230, in addition to the 2 payments that are also due this year, totalling over £690. Now, this would provide, I think, much needed extra support to some of Scotland's lowest income carers with the most intensive caring roles. If passed, it would be a measure that would support around 83,000 carers with the additional costs of caring during the pandemic. And this, of course, would be paid automatically alongside the June carers allowance supplement, and carers would not need to do anything to get the extra payment if they are receiving carers allowance on the qualifying date of the 13th of April. And of course, for unpaid carers not in receipt of carers allowance, there has been a range of financial and wider support made available through, for example, the Scottish Welfare Fund, and I hope that local authorities will consider the needs of unpaid carers and the allocation of this fund. Given the legislation is due to come to an end at the end of September, it is, of course, a one-off payment, and it's important to be clear with carers about that. But I do hope that if the effects of the pandemic reach into the longer time frame, that the Scottish Government will keep an open mind about what further support will be offered to this vital part of the caring effort. The second area concerns Part 4, mental health. Section 250 of the Mental Health Care and Treatment Scotland Act 2003 allows for a person over 16 years of age to nominate a named person to represent their interests and provide support. This nomination must be made in writing, and the signature of the nominee must be witnessed by a prescribed person. That is a regulated health professional, social care worker, social worker or solicitor. The current pandemic and issues caused by social distancing measures have meant that processes such as tribunal work have slowed down. Paragraph 12 of Schedule 1 of the bill temporarily removes the necessity to have nominees' signatures witnessed by a prescribed person by amending Section 250 of the 2003 Act. The change means that one of the safety checks against someone being coerced into nominating a named person has been removed, and this could be a cause for concern. Now, the issue was raised with both the Law Society and Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell at the COVID-19 committee yesterday, and the committee has received assurances from both that there remain adequate safeguards in place to prevent coercion from taking place. During the evidence session, Michael Clancy from the Law Society said that the Law Society's Mental Health and Disability Committee had looked at the provision, and that the committee said that the provision is a pragmatic solution to potential difficulties of arranging for a prescribed person to witness a nominated person's signature during the outbreak. The committee thought that it was important that individuals remain able to nominate a named person subject to appropriate safeguards, and that such a nomination is recognised. The policy memorandum at paragraph 82 confirms that in the view of the government, rights under ECHR are not engaged. So broadly speaking, the Law Society was content with those provisions and did not see much difficulty with them. Presiding Officer, the final area I want to touch on is the very welcome letter to the COVID-19 committee from the Cabinet Secretary for Health, signalling an intention to bring forward an amendment at stage 2 to put beyond doubt that health boards and other agencies, including councils, have the power to be able to take over care homes or care-at-home services where there is a service failure. Now, this failure could be due to financial distress or a threat to the life and well-being of people. So unlike Miles Briggs, I think the opposite in relation to this amendment. This will provide assurance over the quality and continuity of care in these unparalleled and challenging times. Now, I hope, like everyone else, that this is not required, but I think it's important that this amendment is brought forward to provide that additional reassurance to some of the most vulnerable people in our society, and indeed those who care for them, and put what is already in common law beyond any doubt. And I think that will be broadly welcomed by those affected. So thank you, and I conclude by again supporting the general principles of this bill.
Thank you very much. I call Graham Simpson to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is the second emergency bill to deal with the situation in Scotland during the COVID-19 epidemic. And because it's an emergency bill to deal with a particular set of circumstances, we must deal with it in a different way to other bills. We don't have the usual time on our side, so we can't take the evidence as we might like. Our approach must be to identify issues specifically caused by measures taken by government to tackle COVID-19 and indeed the virus itself, and to introduce time-limited laws to deal with those problems. It's not an opportunity to try to test out hobby horses, and I hope members won't do that at stages 2 and 3. Now, I made exactly the same point during the debate on the first coronavirus bill, and my contribution was amusingly described by Neil Finlay as the worst he'd ever heard in the Scottish Parliament. I do hope my good friend Mr Finlay will be less disparaging after today's effort. Now, that's not to say that ideas can't be introduced at later stages, and I'll be happy to talk to Mr Whiteman and others. And in the interests of flagging things up, I'll mention some thoughts, and they're only that today. There's little in the bill that does not meet the tests I set out earlier. For example, the extension of deadline for accounts of registered social landlords was suggested by myself after talking to the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. They were asking for a 3-month extension on signing off audited accounts and submitting them to the Scottish Housing Regulator. There's likely to be a backlog of these, and they can't hold AGMs until they're done. The bill does what they've asked for, and it's very sensible. The proposal in the bill around the additional dwelling supplement is also eminently sensible. It's something I put to Murdo Fraser, but I understand he wasn't as fleet of foot as usual, and someone else beat us to it. I don't know who, but it's to be welcomed anyway. And the issue is this: if you buy a second property because you're still to sell your main residence, you pay the ADS and then get a refund if your main home has been sold within 18 months. But the housing market has pretty much ground to a halt. April and May would normally have been the busiest months of the year, but nothing is happening, and I can't see things picking up quickly. Therefore, it makes sense, and it's only fair, to extend the period within which a previous main residence can be sold and a repayment of the ADS claimed for certain transactions. Now, the proposal to extend that to 2 years seems about right to me, but I'm also happy to speak to Mr Cole Hamilton, who indicated he may wish to go further. We could go further on land and building transactions tax. If we accept that the housing market has temporarily been stopped because of lockdown, then a cut to LBTT or even a time-limited suspension could help to revive the market. And maybe the Cabinet Secretary could give some thought to that. He may not consider this bill to be the place for it, but we need to think about how to get things going again. There are a couple of other areas that might be considered, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for liaising with us already on these. They both relate to properties which are lying empty because either tenants have had to leave or because they're holiday lets. And in the case of the former, I've had representations from landlords. There are a number of cases where tenants have simply had to leave because their rental property was near their place of work, not their main home. Some share facilities, and that's clearly not appropriate right now. So properties which will be used again are lying empty but furnished. If they were unfurnished, they'd get a 6 months exemption from council tax. We would not wish to lose these properties from the rental sector, and we would not wish to see landlords go under. In the case of short-term holiday lets, clearly most, if not all of them, are empty, Again, we don't want to see properties lying empty. Now, we put forward the idea of allowing some flexibility so that owners could let them as private rents for fixed terms and then be able to switch back to holiday lets when things pick up. We need that sort of flexibility during this crisis, but only during this crisis. I also want to briefly mention the proposal around carers allowance. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security, Shirley Ann Somerville, for her constructive approach on this, and indeed in general. The idea of paying an extra £230 to carers is one we can easily support, but of course it comes at a cost of £19 million, and I just wonder where that will come from. Finally, I want to mention something that's been raised with me around the student rent provision in the bill. The policy memorandum says that the 7-day notice is intended for students currently in occupation, but there is a concern that I've heard that the actual legislation as written is not sufficiently clear and could be taken to allow the 7-day period to apply to tenancies already agreed for the next academic year. So I would ask the Cabinet Secretary, when he reappears, if he could look at that and make changes, if needed, at stage 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My good friend Graham Simpson is always a hard act to follow. After the initial UK Coronavirus Act and the first Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020 were passed, frameworks were provided as immediate reactions to the pandemic. Now more than ever, it is of the utmost importance that we as the Scottish Parliament pass crystal clear legislation. Having no clear strategy of what to do in the case of a pandemic, not taking the coronavirus seriously at an early stage, not issuing clear instructions and a dithering leadership has meant that unfortunately the UK now has the second highest absolute death rate in the world, behind only the United States, which at 5 times the UK's population has seen just over 2.5 times as many deaths. And the UK also now has the world's 4th highest per capita death toll. Sadly, at least 33,186 people have died across the UK after testing positive for COVID-19, including 1,973 here in Scotland. Every recorded number represents a human being, a person who loved and was loved, who was needed, who mattered, and who will be missed. I'm sure I speak for us all when I say our thoughts continue to be with their families and friends. Now the Scottish Government's second coronavirus bill covers some matters, some similar matters as the first, as well as items required to overcome issues with statutory deadlines, which due to the crisis cannot now be met. It furthermore addresses some items that reflect the fact that the disruption the pandemic has caused will be with us for some time yet. As someone who represents the islands of Arran and Cymru, I am pleased to see that the Scottish Government has assessed the potential impact of each proposed measure on island communities and concluded that none of the provisions in the bill will have any significantly different impact on island communities. And even at this stage, the bill is already island-proof, and I'm sure colleagues who represent the many other island communities across Scotland will share my sense of reassurance at this. The impact of the new bill will be felt directly in the pockets of the 2,765 unpaid carers in North Ayrshire counts. They will absolutely welcome an additional £230 and 10 pence payment, which will benefit around 83,000 unpaid carers across Scotland. And I welcome the supportive comments of my colleague Graham Simpson and the Conservative Group in support of this. Thanks in part to this bill, unpaid carers in Scotland will receive £690.30 this year on top of their current allowance, as well as other income, a supplement unavailable to counterparts elsewhere in the UK. I believe how we treat our carers says something about how we value them, and I'm proud that Scottish ministers continue to convert this recognition into tangible financial support. Others will welcome measures in the bill reflecting the realities of our housing market due to the crisis. Those who paid the land and buildings transaction tax as additional dwelling supplement over a property sold between 24th September 2018 and 24th of March this year will be helped by the bill's extension of the time period to sell their previous main residence to 27 months, enabling them to claim a repayment from Revenue Scotland for longer. Another practical issue this bill provides for is the matter of building consent within conservation areas by extending the duration of a listed building consent or a conservation area consent that would otherwise lapse during the emergency period because works authorised with consent have not yet begun. The emergency period is that beginning with the coming into force of these provisions and ending on 6th of October, this year. The changes made apply to conservation area consent by virtue of section 63(3) of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Scotland Act 1997. Consents to which the provision applies will instead lapse at the end of an extended period ending on 6th of April 2021, unless works have commenced before the end of that extended period. It is a subject that is not the first to spring to mind, but nevertheless is of importance to those who intend to keep our heritage safe. A matter down the line which nevertheless required anticipation at this stage is the timetable for holding a Citizens' Assembly on climate change. This will now be relaxed, although Parliament has been reassured that it will not diminish the Scottish Government's commitment to the project. As reported in January of this year, more than 2,500 people from across Scotland had engaged in the big climate conversation, with different audience types reflecting differing views on food, land use and energy. The big climate conversation findings will directly inform the update to the climate change plan and develop a new public engagement strategy for climate change. Due to COVID-19 arrangements had to be made flexible on this. The bill is a product of further thinking by ministers and of cross-party engagement. It is more modest and technical than the first, as colleagues have touched on, and that is appropriate at this stage. It contains proposals for statutory timescales, but also regarding medium-term changes, primarily to reflect the fact that the consequences of the pandemic for Scotland will, to greater or lesser degree, be felt for some considerable time. Presiding Officer, while workers and volunteers continue to do their best by stocking shelves, making food deliveries, providing care and medical services, and so on, let's make sure we stick to our end of the bargain. Evidence shows that social distancing is working, and while I too find it challenging at times, we must remember this is a temporary measure. It is necessary to continue doing this right now, as I'm sure everyone who's suffered from, or lost someone to, the coronavirus will tell you. And I, like many others, would like to thank all those who are helping to achieve the social distancing that has keeping the number of deaths and the number of illnesses from coronavirus to a number that would otherwise be of great difficulty for our NHS to cope with. The COVID-19 Committee, as well as the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, looked at the bill last week and yesterday, and I thank civil servants for their continued high quality and speedy work in difficult circumstances to help progress this emergency legislation. People who work in this Parliament are sometimes not given the credit they deserve in supporting not just parliamentarians but our staff to do the jobs that we must at this difficult time. I urge members to vote in favour of the principles of this bill.
Thank you very much. I now call James Kelly to be followed by James Dornan. James Kelly.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. On the day that the number of deaths in Scotland from COVID-19 exceeds the 3,000 mark, it does indeed bring a sobering sort of thought to the consideration of the emergency legislation, the second set of emergency legislation that this Parliament has considered. I want to return to an issue that was in the original draft of the first set of emergency legislation that Murdo Fraser mentioned in his contribution, that of no jury trials. The government withdrew their proposals on judge-only trials from the original emergency legislation. However, I think the original issue which brought that to the fore was the backlog in criminal cases, which were very real concern to victims and also those held in remand. However, 6 weeks since the original emergency legislation was considered, it's 4 weeks since the Justice Secretary hosted a round table with opposition parties and interested stakeholders at which there was some degree of consensus around alternatives to judge-only trials in terms of reducing the number of jurors and looking at social distancing in venues where trials were going to be heard. But now, 6 weeks down the line from the initial consideration of the issue, a working party has been set up, and I have a concern that our progress on that matter has just been far too slow in order to deliver on the objective of speeding up the process of justice, dealing with the backlog and ensuring that those who are victims of crime see justice delivered. In terms of the legislation before us, Schedule 2 deals with criminal proceedings, extension of time limits. However, in some of the sections, the time limits have been removed, and this has been raised as a concern from the Law Society, because in some elements of adjournment and also in remand of prisoners, the time limits have been taken away altogether. And I think there are two kind of consequences of that have got to be considered, is whether it's consistent with human rights laws and human rights conventions for people to be held for unlimited time and for trials to be put off for unlimited time. And also it's a concern about access to justice, going back to the original point I made in my contribution. This could lead to cases taking longer to conclude, and that's a concern not only to victims but those who are remanded in custody. So I think that's something that has to be examined as the bill progresses over the next week. In terms of the custody arrangements that are proposed in the bill, I think these are logical and practical. Obviously, in the current arrangements, we have custody hubs, and I think the practical consideration is that currently because these custody hubs are in police locations, custody officers legally aren't allowed to access these custody hubs. And as there are a number of trials taking place with video links, it makes good sense that provision is made for the custody officers to access the custody hubs. Another provision is that a number of members have mentioned is the extension around confiscation payments. That's proceeds of crime where COVID-19 is a factor. On the face of it, that seems logical and sensible. However, I think these have got to be really tightly controlled to ensure that it does relate to coronavirus. A recent Freedom of Information request highlighted that there was £6 million in unpaid or unrecovered confiscation payments, and this was before COVID-19. So this is clearly an area that is going to be more tightly controlled, because we always must ensure that we recover these proceeds of crime. One of the areas that's not covered in the legislation is just how we treat our care home workers. Today it was announced that 57% of the deaths in Scotland from COVID-19 resulted in care homes. And that really highlights the issue that, you know, we're asking care home workers to go into a workplace to protect people, but potentially to put their lives at risk. And every Thursday, ministers come out and they clap for NHS workers and care home workers. But the reality is that 50% of care home workers are not being paid a real living wage, and that is a scandal. And when that issue is raised with ministers, they wring their hands as opposed to clap their hands. And I think ministers should be given consideration if we're going to have emergency legislation as to how we properly remunerate, treat with dignity those who are putting themselves at risk on the front line. So support the general principles of the bill, Deputy Presiding Officer, but there are some issues of concern and there are also some gaps that we should look at.
Thank you very much. To make a virtual contribution, I call James Dornan, to be followed by Jamie Green. James Dornan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak in today's debate on this essential piece of emergency legislation. I'm also very grateful to be able to join the Parliament virtually from the comfort of my own home, and I hope there are no technical difficulties, and I want to thank the staff that have made this possible for myself and others. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to be a heartbreaking period for us all. The unprecedented nature of our public health emergency requires unprecedented actions and interventions by the government. Today's bill and the previous Coronavirus Scotland Act, which became law last month, are necessary and proportional measures that will help our country pull through these difficult times. And although a large portion of the measures in this bill are technical adjustments to deadlines due to the difficulties caused by the coronavirus outbreak, there are a number of provisions that will, among other things, assist individuals and businesses who are facing hardship. Whilst, of course, our priority has been the health of the population and protecting our NHS, the steps required to control and limit the spread of the outbreak has impacted on many areas of everyday life, none more so than our wider economy. The legislative change and various pieces of published guidance have made life more difficult for all of us, albeit for good reasons, and this has had a major impact on the finances of individuals and businesses. And I'm sure members across the chamber will have heard, as I have, of people and companies experiencing real challenges, but also of many who are taking advantage of the financial support available to them. And therefore welcome steps already taken by the Scottish Government through their business grants, rate relief measures, the unique newly self-employed hardship fund, among other industry-specific support packages, which are helping many of my constituents in Glasgow Cathcart. And on that point, I would sincerely like to thank Glasgow City Council for administering these packages on behalf of the Scottish Government. Now, no one is arguing that this will fully replace lost income, but it will help ensure that our economy is on the best possible footing when we get through this devastating pandemic. As the coronavirus crisis sadly continues, assistance from all spheres of government will be required to continue too. Today's proposed legislation thankfully builds upon the support measures already in place. Presiding Officer, one of the key elements of the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill, as has been mentioned already, is the additional £19.2 million investment in the Carers Allowance Supplement. The Carers Allowance Supplement is an extra payment made to carers in Scotland twice a year in recognition of the important contribution they make to our society, contribution which has been brought into sharp focus during these current times. Should the bill become law, as we hope, then over 13,000 carers in Glasgow will benefit from that further one-off payment during the coronavirus pandemic. This would mean that eligible carers, often people on low incomes who have some of the most intense caring roles, receive an additional £690 this year on top of their carers allowance and any other income. The additional payment of £230 will be an acknowledgement to carers that we know they are providing vital support to family, friends and neighbours, and playing an absolute crucial role in our collective efforts to slow the spread of coronavirus. Our unpaid carers ease pressure on our hospitals and care homes, allowing our NHS and social care staff to continue doing the incredible work in keeping us safe. The many of my constituents involved with the Rainbow Daycare Centre in Carnwadrick, Kojak and the Senior Centre in Castlemilk and the South East Carers Centre, which covers part of my constituency, along with many others, are deserving of recognition, and I hope a number of them will benefit from this added payment. Also, another part of our everyday life that is being severely impacted by the coronavirus is our further and higher education sector. I've got two grandchildren who were doing their exams, the university exams from the house. Don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, and we won't know until the results come through, I'm sure. But whether it's the institutions themselves who are facing a loss of international student income, or the students enrolled in courses, this will be a challenging couple of months for all. One aspect of the bill which I would like to briefly mention is regarding the introduction of notice to leave periods for purpose-built student accommodation and halls of residence. While students living in the mainstream private rented sector have been able to end their tenancy early by giving their landlord 28 days notice, this has not been the case for some of those living in halls of residence or purpose-built student accommodation. Provisions within the bill will therefore bring the student rental sector in line with the private sector, in a move which the NUS Scotland President described as a victory for students. Our students in normal circumstances often struggle financially, so these welcome proposals will relieve a significant extra financial burden on them. Presiding Officer, none of us wish to be in a position that we require new legislation to deal with an emergency situation. In an ideal world, the government's legislative programme would be progressing as normal. But instead, we are now facing a new normal. This is the biggest challenge we have faced in our lifetimes. Life as we know it will be changing for some time, and it will be a societal effort that gets us out the other side. So in closing, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our key workers, from carers to bus drivers, NHS staff to shop workers and volunteers to council staff. We're living in extraordinary times, and to help many individuals, businesses and public services, I'd be delighted to vote for the principles of the bill tonight. I urge colleagues across this chamber to give their support too, and also encourage them to work constructively, as they've done to date, with the Government over the next week throughout the bill's final stages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Jamie Green to be followed by Rona Mackay. Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is my first opportunity to speak in a parliamentary debate since this crisis began. So I'd like to put on record my thanks to the many workers in my region, who I know have been working on the front line in the most difficult of circumstances. I know of the personal tragedy that the virus has brought to many of us and the lasting effect it is having on all of us on our physical and mental health. And I think many outside of the Chamber will ask why we need these emergency bills to progress through Parliament with such haste and in the absence of normal consultation, and also in place of what I suspect is now a lengthy backlog of bills that both the Government and members would rather be progressing through the Chamber, or in some cases not. And I think scrutiny, which becomes routine to the seasoned legislator, to the outside world is still important, as is manifested by the volume of briefings and letters that we get when a bill arrives in our desks. This bill is no different. In normal times, the government of the day will present its programme for government, and it will use legislation to deliver those policy intentions, whether we agree or not with those intentions. But this bill instead is reacting to the circumstances which we face, which are unforeseen and indeed unwelcome. But whatever we pass here today, it must help those who need it most. The shift has moved from the normal economic statistical debates that I think we're all guilty of, the politics of government and the politics of opposition, instead to a debate about the fragility of our health, physical, and in this case, financial. We've put much needed human faces to the often theoretic and mundane nature of legislation. The feedback from the Equality and Human Rights Commission of Scotland on our work today was quite striking. They said, "We know that vulnerable and disadvantaged people are most at risk from this virus, so an equality-driven approach which considers the needs of different groups at the outset will ensure that actions are not only inclusive but effective. Now, we all have a duty to scrutinise this legislation, a task not being made easy by the circumstances we are in, but I ask that we keep that advice in the back of our minds. Our actions must be inclusive, not just effective. And as technical as the measures in this bill are, what we do pass affects real people in the real world. This crisis has reminded us all of the privilege and the gravity of passing law. This pandemic also means we must make significant changes to our legal frameworks, and some of these changes are uncomfortable and would not be acceptable in normal times, but these are not normal times. We lend our support to government to give it the required powers that it needs to deal with the crisis on the principles of temporality and trust. Trust in ministers to use those powers responsibly, and trust that they will use them proportionally. And then in turn, the general public trust us to judge that balance. Much has been said on the specifics of the bill, but I'd like to pick up two specific issues. The first around the issue of bankruptcy. The impact on business and the economy is something we talk about a lot. We've all had unsettling correspondence from individuals and businesses who are worried about their future. Today we found out the economy has already contracted by 2%. Unprecedented measures have had to have been taken to protect incomes and protect jobs. Measures the likes of which I think surprised some even on my side of the political spectrum, no least those in another. The Chancellor yesterday extended the furlough scheme until October, something welcomed by the front benches today in the Chamber. But the elephant in the room is that not everyone will financially reach the other side of this. Many people are genuinely worried about their finances and their livelihoods. We are some of the lucky ones. We cannot underestimate the debt crisis that is lurking around the corner on the other side of these dark days. The debt issue is real. If you've gone from being in a well-paid job to being made redundant through no fault of your own or that of your company, it comes as a physical and mental shock. There's no doubt about that. Your income has reduced, but your outgoings do not. The credit cards, the store cards, the bank loans, the car finance, the tax returns, and those are just credit. The physical outgoings continue, utility bills, rent, taxes, overheads, and the same can be said for individuals as well as businesses. And when this crisis recedes, the debate that we need to be having is not just about the fees that we charge for bankruptcy or how we allow electronic meetings of creditors reverting to physical meetings. We need to have a grown-up conversation about how we tackle COVID-related bankruptcy per se. The other area of this bill that I'd like to briefly touch on are the proposed changes to statutory deadlines and reporting. What is expected of legislators during times of national emergency? Just as the government that led during world wars was the government's priority to tackle what was facing them at the time, our invisible enemy gives some parallels to how we govern today. The fact that government could still be held to account then maintained that vital public faith and trust in extraordinary powers that government needed and government was granted. I have general uneasiness with Section 4 of this bill, which seeks to modify duties on the government and how it prepares and reports to us. Just as we had in the last debate on freedom of information, it is up to the government to make the case to us why there is a need for these provisions. And my view is that that case has not yet been made. The current crisis cannot be the go-to explanation for everything when asked difficult questions. I accept that resource must be redeployed. I accept that the civil service is working in new ways, but it's fundamentally important that the government cannot use the workload of its advisors as a means to avoid scrutiny. There are facts and figures which government must collate, it must track, it must publish, and indeed it must defend. Life has changed, but life must go on. Scrutiny has changed, but scrutiny must go on. In closing, Presiding Officer, the government will enjoy our support in the extraordinary times and the extraordinary measures that it asks for, but it pushes that consensus at its peril.
Thank you very much. I now call Rona Mackay, who will be the last open debate speaker. We will then move to closing speeches. Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The legislation we're debating in the Chamber today could not have been predicted 6 months ago, but as many people have said, we've no choice but to bring forward the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill. I'll be happy to support the general principles of the bill at decision time today because it's essential to do so. We know that the bill encompasses a wide range of areas such as justice, health, individual rights, changes to public services, and crucially important, student tenancy rights and further carer support. Yesterday we had an excellent and actually very moving debate in the Chamber about where we are in this current crisis and where we're going. There are no easy answers, it's impossible to get everything right, but I honestly believe that everyone is doing their best. Every government wants an end to this horror as soon as possible. But we must respect different decisions being made by the four nations, which are being made for very good reason, and I'm confident that the Scottish Government is making the best decisions for our nation. Presiding Officer, today I'd like to concentrate mainly on the justice provisions within the bill in my contribution. But before I do, I'd like to place on record my thanks to Police Scotland for everything they're doing during this current pandemic to keep us safe. Officers have had to adapt, as we all have, to a whole new set of circumstances, enforcing new laws with empathy and patience, and I believe they're doing a fantastic job. Reports of the abuse some have been facing by a small minority of mindless individuals are horrifying, and offenders should be dealt with appropriately. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service should be congratulated too, as they stand ready as ever to bravely carry out their already difficult and dangerous job in these extraordinary new circumstances. So what does the COVID Scotland bill mean for the justice system? The Law Society briefing sums that up well. The Society state that we must protect the rule of law and the interests of justice, ensure the access to justice remains available, and that the fundamental protections of equality and human rights laws are maintained. They rightly say that in a crisis of this scale, it's even more important that these aims are upheld. Compliance with ECHR means that legislative change must be lawful, necessary, proportionate, time-limited and non-discriminatory. So the bill introduces statutory time limits relating to criminal procedure and the ability for prisoner custody officers to provide services for hearings conducted in police stations, giving greater safety and the ability to adhere to strict guidance regarding self-isolation and physical distancing through virtual custody courts taking place within dedicated police hubs across Scotland. There will be continuation of undertakings in relation to non-attendance at court, and no sanctions on the accused if non-appearance is as a result of the coronavirus outbreak, although I'm concerned that there are risks with this, particularly with cases relating to domestic abuse. There are also amendments to the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, where the court may postpone confiscation proceedings for a specified period of time, so that individuals who have been unable to pay a confiscation order within the permitted period for reasons arising from the outbreak. On a practical but important level, the bill will allow documents related to Sheriff Court business to be displayed in the Scottish Courts and Tribunals Service website, removing the existing requirement in commissary procedure to intimate petitions on the walls of court. Is this our legal system finally moving into the 21st century? The bill will also help many people facing bankruptcy, we've heard a lot about that, and adding to the emergency measures which the Scottish Parliament has already approved, and I believe this is entirely fair and sensible. The new temporary legislation will also provide Scottish ministers with the power to introduce reductions in non-domestic rates payable during 2020 to 21, and a wide range of changes necessary to support public services to continue to operate as they were intended during what are exceptional circumstances. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, it's been a horrendous few months for so many families who have lost loved ones, and my sympathy goes out to each and every one of them. It's also been heartbreaking for family members not to have physically seen each other, grandparents who are desperate to hug their grandchildren, elderly parents and those in care homes being forced to isolate, small funerals and cancelled weddings. So, of course, lessons will have been learned during this pandemic when it's finally over. But for now, we must, as a responsible government, make sure we have sufficient and robust legislation in place to cope with the here and now. So I'm pleased to support the general principles of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move to closing speeches. Can I call on Sarah Boyack to wind up, to be followed by Liam Kerr. Sarah Boyack.
Right. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just experimenting with some digital capacity here. Thank you. First of all, I want to draw members' attention to my register of interest regarding my work with SFHA before I returned to Parliament last year. As others have commented, yesterday's debate was at times incredibly moving, and it must set the framework and the backdrop for today's debate. And that's why Scottish Labour recognises the need for this emergency legislation and will put down amendments to strengthen and improve its powers. Alec Rowley made important points about protecting people's social and economic rights and standards, and the need for a precautionary approach underpinned by an effective testing strategy and a stay-at-home message. And I think Andy Whiteman was also right about the need to take action now on our air quality, which means making sure we promote active and sustainable travel, especially given what we now know about the long-term after effects of the coronavirus on people's health. That's something we cannot ignore. I'm very glad today, like several colleagues, to see the proposals on student accommodation. I raised that issue during the non-domestic rates bill, highlighting the cost to students and the lack of rights for them as tenants. And the difficulty students have had in releasing themselves from these leases has been made alarmingly clear by this pandemic. And I, like others, have had parents and students getting in touch to highlight the enormous financial costs for rooms they are not using. So I welcome these moves by the Scottish Government to ensure that students are able to leave their leases, but I would put a marker down that it's vital that coming out of this crisis, we don't return to the way things were, with private, purpose-built student residences operating without proper rent regulation and protection for students. Likewise, Polly McNeill was absolutely right to raise concerns about people who are struggling to pay their rent due to the impact of the pandemic, who need to be supported now to keep their home. I know my own council in Edinburgh has done sterling work on homelessness throughout this crisis. We've seen rough sleeping almost eradicated from our streets during the pandemic, and we must not, under any circumstances, allow it to return. So it will be vital that our council in Edinburgh and other councils across the country have the resources to make sure that job is completed. I want to highlight the fact that Jackie Bailey has been debating how we could improve the bill by amending it to going a bit further to protect those who find themselves in debt due to the loss of their jobs. And I hope the Cabinet Secretary will be able to support her proposals. We've all had local businesses in touch who are falling through the net financially. I've got one constituent who was ready to open his business, had the staff recruited, invested in the premises, and just missed that capacity to open up. He's not eligible for any support. We've been pushing to see what's available. He's not even able to get a response from HMRC. So the job is not yet done to support businesses in the short term. And I'm also still hearing about employers not being prepared to furlough their staff. So I hope who's summing up from the Scottish Government will make clear the Scottish Government's support for employers doing the right thing, because we need businesses able to come back to life after the pandemic, rather than seeing their staff's livelihoods crushed for years. It's also good to see the Scottish Government considering giving local authorities new powers to buy care homes, especially if it's about improving the quality of care. There's clearly an issue, though, how staff are treated at the moment and don't have access to appropriate PPE and widespread testing now. That has been raised across the parties, and James Kelly was absolutely right to flag the importance of better pay for staff. But I'd say we also need to look at career opportunities and to end the characterisation of care work as low-skilled. If this crisis has shown us anything, it is how fundamentally wrong that view is, whether it's carers who work from home or carers who are working in care homes. And Polly Mitney was also very importantly raising the issue of equality. And there is an important link that we need to be highlighting here: the impact of the pandemic on older people, people from BME communities, and they need to be properly supported, as well as people being cared for and those doing the care. There are equalities issues for both of them. Finally, I think it's crucial that although we will work with the government to strengthen this bill, it's important that we don't forget the issue of short-term action now, to think about keeping businesses afloat, to ensure everybody has a safe place to stay. And it's vital to think now and to start planning now about how we come out of this crisis, how we strengthen our economy, what the social distancing rules are going to be for months to come, and how businesses can actually start thinking about that now and planning for it now, even though we are all doing the right thing and staying at home. We also need to think more about the safety net our communities need going forward. There's something about dealing with the urgent crisis and the pandemic now, but if there's something that this pandemic has done, it has cruelly exposed the deep-seated inequalities that people face in our society, and we need to work together to get rid of that. One of the things I've certainly been saying to constituents getting in touch with me who are not being well treated by their employer, who are suffering because they're not getting access to PPE is, are you in a trade union? And it is astonishing the number of them who aren't, who don't have that moral support, who don't have that support in their employer. So there's a lot of stuff we can do, I believe, as MSPs now to support people. We need to think about the short term, but we also need to think about what kind of society we want to live in. This is emergency legislation. We need to get it right, but let's not think about the future and think about how we can work together to create a better society in Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call on Liam Kerr to conclude for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In closing for the Scottish Conservatives, I want to finish the debate where these benches started. Now, whilst famously I'm of a much more sunny disposition than the legendarily grumpy Tompkins, I found several aspects of his contribution very well founded. Many speakers highlighted that this is an emergency situation and it requires emergency measures, but it is imperative that the scrutiny of legislation is carried out properly and that government is properly held to appropriate account. For understandable reasons, being the current emergency, this bill, like its predecessor, is following an expedited procedure which significantly curtails that parliamentary scrutiny. Now, in another forum earlier this week, I referenced the great Scottish law lord, Lord Reid, who insisted that laws must be clear, certain and capable of enforcement. And that is no less an imperative where the bill is an emergency. This means us doing our jobs to the best of our ability during this process. Jamie Green was absolutely right. It is indeed a privilege to be in a position to pass law. And also that means supporting the work of the new COVID-19 committee, the report of whose session yesterday I read with great interest.
and the inquiry which I understand will be undertaken by the Equality and Human Rights Committee. But it also, I would suggest, requires us to be somewhat cautious about what is in such a bill. In his opening remarks, the Cabinet Secretary correctly referenced there are some very important protections in this bill. Unquestionably true. But then the Law Society have raised that the provisions around the UEFA European Championship, for example, and Kenny Gibson talked about the citizens' assemblies, may not fall within that category. These are important matters, there is no doubt about that. But it is right, in my view, to gently question whether it is appropriate use of legislation of this type for matters which some would suggest fall outside the stated aim of addressing an emergency situation. I do understand the rationale, Cabinet Secretary, for including this sort of thing, in that time is short, and so if something can be dealt with quickly, it perhaps should be. But I remain to be persuaded that where matters are not directly an emergency, they should fall to be considered in legislation such as this.
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't disagree with the member, but just to take the example of the Citizens' Assembly on climate change, there is a statutory commitment to that within a timescale. And it is directly related, the inability to meet that timescale is directly related to the coronavirus pandemic. So as a result of which I think I would defend that one. I might debate some other ones, but I think I would defend that one and other ones because there is a direct connection.
And I look forward to that debate. I think the point remains the same. We should be very cautious about using an expedited procedure for anything that does not absolutely mandate it. And on a similar point, we must be very careful that anything within this bill is subject to that appropriate scrutiny. If the Chamber will permit me to corrupt the aphorism, we must avoid legislating in haste, repealing at leisure. On which note, I thought Alex Cole-Hamilton spoke powerfully and persuasively around the freedom of information provisions. He talked about how rejection of this provision by 4 parties on the 1st of April nevertheless led to a distorted result. Now, in 2009, the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution recommended a raft of measures to ensure emergency powers are exercised appropriately. Clive Walker, the Professor of Criminal Justice Studies at the University of Leeds, gave evidence and said at the time the various parliamentary stages are there for good reason. Members of both houses get to properly debate and discuss the issues, while people outside can also lobby and make a contribution. If you have legislation that's being enacted in a week, then none of this happens. There isn't time to take evidence. Clearly that is correct. And as we move through this process, we must be cognizant of the inability to ensure that changes we propose or make will not, by definition, be subject to the same interrogation that would normally be possible. I think the Cabinet Secretary was right in his intervention to suggest that not all amendments are inherently wrong, but Miles Briggs was right to counter that we must guard against the consequences of poor legislation. And in that regard, it was good to hear that there looks to be cross-party support in principle for Adam Tompkins' proposed FOI amendments at stage 2. And also good to hear Willie Coffey's call for prompt post-legislative scrutiny. Sticking with this theme, the same House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution recommended, in order to ensure emergency legislation was as robust as possible, that the legislation should include a sunset clause, setting out the timing for new measures to end. We agree, and as we've heard, it does, which is why I was so concerned to hear Adam Tompkins' point that by no means all of the secondary legislation made by ministers in connection with coronavirus has been made under these acts. That being the case, safeguards such as the sunset clause presumably will not apply to those provisions. And if Willie Rennie really does look forward to the day when all this is repealed, he presumably will want to be reassured of what falls within the category all this. And several speakers referred to the Delegated Powers Committee's recommendation that the Scottish Government report on all subordinate legislation made in this crisis. And I'll be pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary's thoughts and conclusions on this in closing. Turning to some of the other contributions, the justice provisions are obviously something I'm concerned with. The Justice Committee has today sent a letter to the convener of the COVID-19 committee making important points, which I'm sure will help the process. I listened to Annabel Ewing making an important point around the proceeds of crime provisions and whether, as she put it yesterday in committee, the provisions could facilitate evasion and potentially backtrack on some of the good progress that's been made. This is a point that had been concerning me also, and like her, I'm reassured to hear the Crown Office raised the issue and are in support of the provisions and, in fact, was involved in identifying the need for the changes. James Kelly demanded rightly that this area be tightly controlled. He is right to, with figures such as he quoted existing pre-virus being very concerning indeed. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, and one final point I wish to make, I remind the Chamber of the COVID Committee convener's reference to the policy memorandum. The changes made herein are far-reaching and unprecedented. We will support the principles, but it is clear that we must hear from as many voices as possible. I echo the Cabinet Secretary's opening remarks about the positive cross-party nature of this bill's development, but I also remind those watching that the COVID-19 Committee is seeking views on this bill. Is it necessary? Will it achieve its purpose? And crucially, how can it be improved? And details on how to submit those views can be found on the Scottish Parliament website by noon tomorrow. I opened by saying that the purpose of this bill is to respond to the emergency situation caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. In its principles, it does that. And I look forward with my colleagues across the Chamber to honing that over the next week of its progress.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Minister, Jenny Gilruth, to wind up our debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I would like to start by thanking Murdo Fraser and the members of the Parliament's COVID Committee for their consideration of the bill yesterday and, of course, for their contributions to the debate today. It has been a consensual debate and that is welcome given the topic at hand. Liam Kerr mentioned the House of Lords, and you won't often find me citing the House of Lords in here, Presiding Officer, but as has already been said, in 2009 they suggested 5 good principles that should apply to all emergency legislation. The first is that scrutiny should be maintained as far as possible. And through Mr Fraser's dedicated committee, through the use of technical measures, through agreeing with Parliament a slower timetable for this bill, we have sought to allow for as much scrutiny as we can, as grumpy as that may have made Adam Tompkins. The second principle is to ensure the technical quality of all legislation. The bill may have been prepared at pace, but it has been prepared by a large number of officials from across government, and the full range of accompanying documents, including the detailed explanatory notes and a detailed financial memorandum, have been prepared alongside it. This is not rushed legislation. The third principle is that other bodies should be involved in the process where possible. Again, I commend the COVID-19 Committee for being able to take evidence from the Law Society yesterday, and to those bodies where consultation was able to happen, again, I'm thankful. The policy memorandum to the bill sets out each policy and who has been involved in its development, and we have conducted as much consultation, formal and informal, as was possible in the circumstances. Fourthly, that emergency legislation should only be used where justified, and as Annabel Ewing said, we need to act prudently and with caution. Again, I would point to the policy memorandum where we have set out the connection to coronavirus of each measure in the bill and our reasons for regarding each change as necessary and urgent. Yes, I will.
Adam Tompkins.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way. She says that this is not rushed legislation. The deadline for all members of this Parliament to put down amendments for Stage 2 is noon on Friday. When will we see the government amendments for Stage 2?
Minister.
Thank you. I thank Adam Tompkins for that intervention. You say it's not rushed. Well, it is rushed, rather. We are where we are. Coronavirus is not slowing down anytime soon. We are working as quickly as we can on this. And the reality is we are faced with an unprecedented situation. And I'm advised by the Cabinet Secretary you will see our amendments on Friday. Finally, it is recommended that additional transparency should be built into the emergency legislation. The Cabinet Secretary has set out how the use of the bill will be controlled, reviewed and reported on by Government and by Parliament. Scrutiny of this bill will not end with its passage, and in many ways it will only be the beginning. Presiding Officer, turning to some of the specific points raised by members today, and in particular raised by the COVID Committee in their Stage 1 letter on the bill. In terms of student residential leases, this was raised by a number of members and it was widely welcomed by Andy Whiteman, by Willie Coffey, by Pauline McNeill and by Miles Briggs. And the committee has asked for some clarification on how the new provisions on purpose-built student accommodation would work in practice. And I can confirm that the phrase for a reason relating to coronavirus was chosen deliberately so as to allow termination of leases not simply as a direct result of the virus, a particular case of the infection, or to control transmission, but also because of its wider effects, social, financial, and to do with the way that universities are reorganising their teaching. Now, Graham Simpson raised a question about the application of the new 7-day notice period for those who are already in attendance, and I'm advised by the Housing Minister he will write to Mr Simpson directly on that point. On the right to marry, I did not have Adam Tompkins, Murdo Fraser and Michael Russell pegged as old romantics, but on a serious point, marriage is an important right, as Adam Tompkins outlined. And as the Cabinet Secretary confirmed, the Government is currently preparing guidance in conjunction with the National Records of Scotland. And for Mr Tompkins' information, 20 marriages were registered on an emergency basis between March 26th and today. But he is right to raise the issue here around messaging, and as the Cabinet Secretary confirmed, there is nothing in legislation preventing marriages from taking place currently, so that is something that will be looked at. Both the committee and James Kelly have had questions today about the changes to criminal time limits in the bill. We are satisfied that the interests of the accused and the wider interests of society in having an effective system of justice are both appropriately taken into account in the bill as drafted. The Minister for Community Safety, I am advised, would be happy to meet with Mr Kelly, though, on this point to discuss further. On the additional dwelling supplement, this extension was welcomed by Miles Briggs and I think by Graham Simpson as well. I think he thought that we'd stolen his idea on this one. The committee asked us to set out an increase of 9 months and that was arrived at for the period during in which an additional dwelling supplement can be reclaimed. The question being, why did we arrive at that time? This was due to our analysis around the housing market in Scotland and also the impact that coronavirus is having on people's ability to sell their houses. This includes substantial rural housing market in Scotland, which Alex Hamilton alluded to in his contribution, and I appreciate the Liberals will be bringing forward amendments on that. And Rona Mackay, sorry, I didn't hear you there, so I'll give way.
Rona Mackay.
Thank the Minister for taking that intervention. Just on the question of timing, can I ask the Minister about the provision made in the bill about those arrested and released as an undertaking? The bill extends the period for expiry of such undertakings to 90 days. These dates are currently set at 28 days generally and 14 days for domestic abuse cases. The bill now extends these both to 90 days. Could the Minister comment on that, please?
Yes.
I thank Rona Mackay for that intervention. This is a really important issue, and I know it's one she'll take seriously as the Deputy Convener of the Justice Committee. The Government is aware and is particularly sensitive to the increased risk that those vulnerable to domestic abuse are under while they are required, where possible, to stay in their homes. And I think this point was picked up on by Pauline McNeill in her contribution as well. A key reason for this temporary change is to protect those at risk of domestic abuse. And during the coronavirus outbreak, an arrested person may not be able to attend court in accordance with their undertaking due to public health guidance or infection. This change is about ensuring that any protective conditions included in an undertaking are prevented from expiring because someone is unable to appear in court. Without any action, these undertakings would expire in an increasing number of cases, putting those at risk of domestic abuse at further unneeded risk. And I would like to reassure all members that this measure has no impact on a person's existing right to apply to court to have their conditions reviewed or to have further conditions attached. That being said, the law currently makes a differentiation in terms of domestic abuse cases, and I will look with officials at how that can be adapted, I guess, going forward. And again, I would imagine that the Minister for Community Safety may wish to have some input on that. Coronavirus. Yes, I will.
Andy Whiteman.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. I wasn't sure what the appropriate point was, but I just wanted to check that the ministers were aware of the briefing that we've received today from the Children and Young People's Commissioner, in particular his concerns about making sure that children under 18 should be excluded from the criminal provisions of this bill, and indeed that the regulations should be amended to avoid unnecessary criminalisation of 16 to 17-year-olds.
Minister.
I thank Andy Whiteman for that intervention. I am aware of the briefing that came from the Children's Commissioner, which makes a number of points, some of which are actually contained already in the bill in terms of human rights and in terms of the child welfare assessment, which is already contained in the legislation. With regards to the legislation in terms of 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, that's not something that this bill would seek to look at. We have to bring this legislation into line with Scots law as quickly as we can.
If the Minister could address the front,
sorry. And at the moment, this is where we are. So to get the legislation through, we need to bring it into line with where we are at the moment in terms of the legislation that is currently in front of us. But I'm sure it's something that we would look at going forward in terms of the UNCRC. I'd quite like to make some progress. Coronavirus will impact us all in different ways, but for those carers on the lowest incomes and with the most intensive caring roles, it will inevitably have among the most significant impacts, including bearing higher costs while other services are not available. And Pauline McNeill was right to point to the fact that women are disproportionately likely to find themselves in a caring role. All those who receive the carers allowance provide 35 hours of unpaid care weekly as a minimum, and many do significantly more. The earnings threshold is £128 weekly, but for many, because of their caring responsibilities, holding down any sort of job is just not possible. Young carers aged 16 or over with that sort of intensive caring role can apply for a carers allowance additionally. Just to move on, Presiding Officer, there's a couple of points I want to come to before closing. The issue of FOI deadlines was raised by Adam Tompkins, Alex Hamilton, Andy Whiteman, and I suspect that's why Neil Findlay was on his feet. I accept that this issue continues to cause some debate, and we want consensus on this legislation. I think Alec Rowley said that this shouldn't be about party politics, so we will work with all parties at stage 2 to make sure we get that consensus. And in terms of... I'm concluding. Alec Riley also raised the point with regards to the work that's been done by the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy with trade unions. And as the First Minister said at FMQs today, we remain concerned about those who are being forced to attend their work when the clear message from the Government at this moment in time is to stay at home unless your work is absolutely essential. And Sarah Boyack mentioned that messaging from the Government to employers. And I just want to say again on the record that message is clear: stay at home, save lives. That is our messaging, and that is where we are in terms of our advice to employees and employers. Presiding Officer, this emergency situation undoubtedly demands emergency legislation, but emergency legislation demands care, not just in terms of scrutiny and transparency, as I set out earlier, but in a more fundamental way. It demands care to ensure that important values are not forgotten as we develop and pass laws at pace. And again, I would point members to the policy memorandum. We have set out our human rights analysis of the impact of each measure and the balance that has been struck by it. Presiding Officer, we built consideration of the human rights impact of each measure into the process of policy development, and we will put human rights impact at the heart of our approach to reviewing and reporting on these bills. We have also had equality and an assessment of impact of the core of our policies, at the core rather of our policy development. And again, our policy memorandum sets out our assessment of each measure's impact on island communities, on local government and on sustainable development. We also published on Monday a business and regulatory impact assessment for the bill, and a quality impact assessment, a Fairer Scotland duty interim assessment and a child's rights and wellbeing impact assessment that was actually requested by the Children's Commissioner in his briefing ahead of today's debate. These are all available on the Scottish Government's website. Human rights, impact, equality, these are not optional extras that can be dispensed with in emergency legislation. These are matters that are more important than ever in emergency legislation. They are at the core of what we do. Presiding Officer, I hope members will join with me in supporting the general principles of the bill this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Point of order, Adam Tompkins.
Presiding Officer, we've just heard from the Government front bench that they do not intend to publish their amendments for Stage 2 of this bill until Friday. The deadline for all of us ordinary non-government members for Stage 2 amendments is Friday at noon. Can the Presiding Officer confirm that the convener of the COVID committee that will take the bill at Stage 2 will have the discretion to take manuscript amendments from us, perhaps amending government amendments, which we've not had advance sight of, even if we are unable to make the Friday noon deadline? And can he urge ministers to submit their amendments to their own bill substantially in advance of that deadline so that we have time to consider them?
A point of order, Michael Russell.
Can I just make it clear, the Government will attempt to table its own amendments as early as possible. I am happy to share them as quickly as I can with the COVID committee and with other members. This is not an attempt to hold anything back, and I would support the issue of manuscript amendments if for any reason those amendments could not be brought forward until closer to the deadline. I want to be as helpful as possible. There is no intention of holding anything back. I might just say that I would like to see amendments from others as well, so that we can help to make sure that this process is as easy as possible. And I have made that point to the individual parties today, and I'd be happy to exchange amendments at any time when we can.
Can I thank the Minister for that helpful contribution? Just to clarify on the point of order, yes, the Bureau did discuss this matter when agreeing the timetable yesterday and when proposing it to Parliament, which was agreed yesterday. The convener will have the discretion to select manuscript amendments, and much as I would, or the Chair will, in selecting them at Stage 3, I would expect the convener to exercise discretion in such a situation, but it will be up to the convener. Thank you for that point of order. We're going to move on now to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion 21710 in the name of Kate Forbes on a financial resolution for the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill. Could I invite the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, to move this motion?
Formally moved.
Thank you very much. The next item is consideration of business motion 21726 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak in the motion, but can I ask, the question is that motion 21726 is agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed. Thank you. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I call on Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau once more to move motion 21727 and 21728 on approval of an SSI?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now, I believe that Annie Wells might wish to speak against this motion. I call Annie Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Everyone in this chamber supports a deposit return scheme. There is no dispute that a deposit return scheme can increase recycling rates and protect our environment. The question is timing. We support the delayed implementation to July 2022 in light of the COVID outbreak. However, the Scottish Conservatives don't think that goes far enough. Small businesses are struggling more than ever. Many of them won't see 2021, despite the vast financial support packages provided by the UK and Scottish governments. The business community will be responsible for making DRS work. Now is not the time to force them to scrutinise and engage with legislation adding to their burden. Yeah.
Willie Rennie.
Annie Wells for allowing us to put this on the record. The scheme, she is right, has cross-party support, but these regulations certainly do not. Nobody knows what the world is going to look like in 6 months' time or even next month. So why we're rushing these regulations now for something that is in 2 years' time is just beyond me. Future regulations may be just as ambitious, even more so. So we support these measures, but just not now. That's why we'll abstain at voting time.
Annie Wells.
Thanks for that intervention. I totally agree with what Willie's saying there. Now is not the time. We need the government to be fully focused on tackling COVID too. We supported the delay to the climate change plan for that reason. But we can't see why the climate change plan can be delayed, only for the deposit return scheme legislation to be brought forward at this crucial moment. It's not a question of scrapping the work on DRS. The issue is one of timing. The environment would be better served by waiting until the business community can turn their focus more towards DRS and make a success of it. The climate crisis needs urgent action, but tackling COVID has to be a top priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And could I call on the Minister, Marie Goujon, to reply on behalf of the Government?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm speaking in favour of the two instruments today. The first is the regulations which will establish an ambitious deposit return scheme for Scotland, covering single-use drinks containers made of PET plastic, glass and metal. And the second is an order giving SEPA powers to impose civil sanctions in the event someone commits an offence under those regulations. Now, I think it's already been highlighted that there is broad consensus across this chamber. Yes.
Rhoda Grant.
We share the concerns already expressed in the chamber today, but this is not the time. We support the principle, but we feel that the retail businesses are under a lot of pressure at the moment. Will the Minister ensure that what support they require is put in place, including looking at a delay in this, if that is what is necessary under the current conditions?
Minister Marie Goujon.
I will be addressing that point and the other points raised by members in the chamber as I develop my comments. Again, as I said, there is broad agreement across the chamber, and that's recognised, and indeed around Scotland, that a well-designed DRS is a great opportunity to create the more circular economy we want to see in Scotland, while reducing our contribution to the global climate emergency and taking harmful litter off our streets, parks and beaches. And since we laid the draft regulations before Parliament in September, we have listened carefully to stakeholders and made improvements to ensure that we have the best possible DRS for Scotland. Now, I know that some members think that the new go-live date of the 1st of July 2022 is too late. Some also think that it is too early. Clear evidence from industry, tested through an independent review, identified this as the earliest date we could be confident would deliver a successful scheme. And while we determined that before COVID-19, when later faced with the virus, we took the view that the extension would also provide the flexibility industry needs to respond to the pandemic. We will, of course, continue to monitor closely the impact of COVID-19 on Scottish businesses and continue to assess if any further flexibility is needed. Yes.
Graham Simpson.
Thank the Minister for taking the intervention. She says that the date was set before the COVID outbreak. Has she consulted since COVID to assess whether that date is still appropriate?
Minister Marie Goujon.
I don't know if the member heard the previous comment I'd made directly before he stood up there, because I've said that we will continue to monitor the situation closely to see if any further flexibility is needed with that. And I would hope that members across the chamber would agree that doing that is only right, fair and reasonable in these unprecedented circumstances. Passing these two instruments today isn't the end of the process, it's just the beginning of the work to implement an ambitious DRS for Scotland, which will support the circular economy we want and contribute to the low emissions world that we need. And we're looking forward to working closely with industry on the next stage of work to deliver Scotland's DRS while remaining ever mindful of the impact of COVID-19.
Thank you very much. Now, the vote on this matter will come, on both motions will come at decision time, to which we now come. So the first question is that motion 21712 in the name of Michael Russell on the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill at stage 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The second question is that motion 21710 in the name of Kate Forbes on a financial resolution to the Coronavirus Scotland No.2 bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. Next question is that motion 21727 in the name of Graham Day on approval of SSI be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on motion 21727 and members may vote now. The result of the vote on motion 21727 in the name of Graham Day is yes 36, no 16. There were 19 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 21728, and this is on the environmental regulations, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on motion 21728 and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 21728 in the name of Graham Day is yes 50. There were no votes against. There were 19 abstentions and the motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes business. That concludes decision time. Therefore, I close this meeting. Now, I would urge members, those who wish to leave, to do so safely. However, I would ask all members who wish to do so to remain and, if they wish to rehearse using the voting system, to vote electronically. So any member who wishes to remain to rehearse the chance, take the opportunity to vote electronically, may do so. At some point, all members will have to do this.